This video is the second part of a comprehensive lore guide to the Dark Souls series, focusing entirely on the second game. I will cover every detail and situate every event in a cohesive chronological order, solving its mysterious overarching narrative. I highly recommend you watch the first episode before this one. Dark Souls 2 is a direct sequel to Dark Souls 1. Watching this video before that one is like skipping the first book of a series. I also explain my method of analysis in detail in that episode as to avoid confusion. And lastly, before I start talking about the story of Dark Souls 2, I will dispel a few bogus claims and incorrect notions, all of which are spouted by people who do not understand the story of this series in the slightest. Yes, Dark Souls 2's story is entirely canonical. It is, indeed, a direct continuation of the first games, and is followed upon by the third one. As is often the case, people blame Dark Souls for their ignorance. As soon as they can't make sense of something, they jump to the conclusion that it must be the fault of the game, or of the series, and not their own. It's like when the SP blames the controls or the mechanics for his poor gameplay.
Why am I toxic? What?
As I will conclusively demonstrate, the story of Dark Souls 2 is as masterfully written as that of the other two games, and the trilogy would not work without it. I will now address a prevalent misunderstanding about the lore and world's design of Dark Souls. Nearly every named kingdom and character is featured in the games themselves, and you can determine that through a study of item and NPC placements, that is, environmental storytelling, text and dialogue, narrative and thematic analysis, inductive reasoning, and so on. It's wrong to assume that most of them are situated in faraway lands we never get to explore. For example, Torland and Karim, two named locations, are the main provinces within the world of man. Vinheim centers around the Duke's archives, which is why that place is built around a human frame, and why we find various items related to the Dragon School there, and also why Logan, the most important character associated with Vinheim, travels back to the archives at the height of his journey, after its abandonment by the nobles who fled the world of man, when Gwyn left to link the fire. Sif is considered to be the grandfather of sorcery, and he studies the ancient dragons. It's only fitting that the sorcerers of royalty studied under him, at his archives. He was a duke after all. Astora is the Middle Earth of Dark Souls, the vast, vast country that contemplates many kingdoms, and that connects the allegorical heaven, the world of man, with the underworld, Izalith. Its capital is New Londo, and Ulusil, Baldur, and Katarina are examples of city-states or kingdoms situated within its borders. The Firelink Shrine, the Undead Burg and Parish, the Darkroot Garden, the Valley of Drakes, New Londo, the Depths, and Blystown, and so on, were all part of Astora, though the country fell to the curse and to the abyss, and we visit only its ruins. The Ring of the Evil Eye is imbued with the power of Life Drain, the secret art of the Four Kings and the Dark Wraiths, who ravaged Astora's capital, New Londo. I explained this in more detail in the previous episode. As a final example, Londor is simply the ruined world of the future, which is why it is inhabited by age-old hollows, and why the Morion Blade depicts the roofs of the buildings of times past, and so on. The pilgrims of the Sable Church journey back to the past to meet their lords-to-be. Having said that, some people will certainly respond with, "But it makes the game's world feel smaller, and so I refuse to accept it," or something along these lines. That notion is simply misguided. We must not make assumptions about the story of the games based on headcanon and personal preferences. So you might be asking yourself why From Software would create such small worlds, and the answer is quite simple. Their goal was to create a compact and coherent narrative that uses its medium to the fullest, with even the most innocuous gameplay mechanics working in tandem with the story, and the world building orients itself to its course and not the other way around. Dark Souls is not a world building project, like a glorified D&D campaign, but a game that is a masterpiece of storytelling with a strong literary character. As a consequence of the curse of Undead, time became convoluted. Physical locations were fixed to specific time zones, which means that as the player character journeys through the lands, he is also traveling through time. In the first game, we travel from the future, where the Undead Asylum is, to the present, where the continent of Lordaeron, as we explore it, is. The majority of NPCs travel from the past, where most of the named places hail from, to the present. This is what the questline of Laurentius is all about. He originates from the Great Swamp, and wished to travel to the future to learn pyromancy. He precedes the war against the demons, the events that branded pyromancy as heretical, as the witches opposed Gwyn, the king of the gods, as evidenced by his dialogue, which claims that pyromancy thrives in Lordran. In reality, as a result of the war, pyromancy was forbidden, and later a brutal witch hunt took place at Karim, and the many practitioners of the art were publicly tortured and executed, despite their status as members of the nobility of the world of men. Laurentius is completely ignorant of this development, for he comes from a time when Isilif and Anorlondo were allied and even traded with each other. The depths were, in the past, similar to our world's Silk Road, a vast system of tunnels and roads that connected the lower and upper realms through Astora, the Middle Earth. Anorlondo sent Titanite slabs, which were the domain of the gods, meaning they were monopolized by Gwyn's family, to Isilif, and in return received golems and weapons. The bells of awakening used to be rung to signal the coming of envoys and goods from one kingdom to the other. But in the present, because of the political developments of the War of Anorlondo and Isilif, the depths have been reformed into a sewer complex, which was later employed as an improvised prison to greedy undead, that is, thieves, murderers, and cannibals. Laurentius, being none the wiser, traveled upward through the depths and jumped through time to the present, and ended up captured by a cannibal. When one becomes undead, he is essentially removed from linear time and space. The curse links his soul to the sun, and the timeline converges to the celestial body of light, while the past gets buried in the dark. This is why the undead are driven away from their homelands, and why their bones take you back to the bonfires. Laurentius' questline ends with him traveling to Blystown, the place that used to be known as a Great Swamp, his very homeland. He tragically loses himself, for the fruits of his naive dream are disillusionment and homelessness. Similarly, Solaire voluntarily becomes undead to jump into the future in search of the sun. The reason why I explain this is that this concept is more pronounced in Dark Souls 2, and intentionally so, from the very start of the game. It's made clear from its opening cinematic. We travel from the future to the distant past by jumping into a portal of darkness in a lake that takes us to the memory of Drang Lake, which was consumed by the Abyss. In Drang Lake, we go from one ruined land to another, and are often connected through physically impossible paths, such as the unfortunately infamous transition between the Earthen Peak and the Iron Keep. However, if you think that transition was a mistake by the developers, you'd also have to believe they were foolish enough to commit that same error for the very first area of the game, as when the player enters Heide's Tower of Flame, the path he just travels through is sunk in the deep water. Similar distortions of space-time are abundantly present in Dark Souls 1 and 3, to a minor degree, because those games do not take place in kingdoms that were entirely buried by the Abyss, which embodies darkness and forgetfulness, as Drang Lake was. They were just ruined by it. If you don't understand how the phenomenon of time travel works in Dark Souls, you will ignorantly blame the game for its seemingly nonsensical world design, when, in reality, the game's dreamlike nature is deliberate. The opening cinematic of Dark Souls 2 even refers to Drang Lake as a kingdom that supernaturally inhabits the dreams of Hollows, and the game features references to Alice in Wonderland, a surrealist story about a girl's journey in a convoluted dream world. Drang Lake is, as we find it, nothing but an imperfect memory of a ruined continental empire. It is a murky, forgotten land that was buried by the Abyss, and so, the bearers of the curse who visit it experience only a fragmented, imperfect recollection of it. Lordran, and later, Lothric, are not too dissimilar. All of them fell prey to the curse, to darkness, but Drang Lake is the darkest of the three lands. As a final disclaimer, there will be several claims that may initially seem strange, but rest assured, they will be thoroughly explained in later sections of the video or of the series, when it's more appropriate to do so. I've chosen to prioritize clarity and ease of understanding in this case, ensuring that the broader narrative can be grasped with greater simplicity and coherence. If you want to see an explanation of my method of analysis, which takes into account every single aspect of these games, from text and dialogue to visuals, environmental storytelling, references to literature and religion, game mechanics, and more, you can check out the opening segment of the first episode of this series, which will be linked below. Though I must say it is partially outdated in relation to my current research, and will be remade in the future. Also, feel free to ask me any questions in the comments, I will be glad to reply. This is it for the introduction. May you be welcome to the second episode of the Complete Lore Guides to Dark Souls. After Gwyn was ousted from power, and Gwendolyn took his place as King of the Gods, the inhabitants of the world of man left their homeland. The souls amassed by the one who links the fire flourish anew, meaning they reincarnate. About half of them fuel the bonfire, the recreated first flame, advancing the natural cycle of the world, which was halted by Gwyn's undead curse, and half of them are emitted by the fire. So, an expedition to new land was needed to hunt for the souls that were flourishing anew because of the linking of the flame. This parallels the hunt for large souls that took place during the Age of Ancients. Men searched for stray embers buried in the ground like treasures.
Then from the dark they came and found the souls of lords within the flame. And the furtive pygmy, so easily forgotten.
The man who left a ruined Lordran would eventually discover an unexplored continent, a new world which they would call Heide, a name that means area of uncultivated land. This event mirrors our world's Age of Discovery, when the maritime expeditions by the Portuguese took place. In the case of Dark Souls, during each Age of Discovery, there were two expeditions, each conducted by one of the noble houses of the world of man, Torland and Karim. The first one was led by Havel, a noble from the house of Torland, which derived from Gwyn's lineage, and the second was led by Lydia, a noble from the house of Karim, which derived from Velka's lineage. Lydia's name comes from a biblical character, a wealthy businesswoman who sells purple cloth, a reference to Velka's purple miracles of divine retribution as well as to her noble origin, and who most notably becomes the first European to convert to Christianity, a particularly significant reference, since fire linking is directly based on the Christian faith. Upon settling on Heide, this barren land, devoid of civilization, Havel founded a country and named it after him, which goes in line with the characterization of the members of Gwyn's clan as proud and blunt men. Havel means cockerel, a male chicken, the name being emblematic of the dawn, which, in the context of Dark Souls 1, refers to the dawn brought by Gwyn, and in the context of Dark Souls 2, to the new dawn that the discovery of Heide would call upon. Havel was, in times of old, deified as Old Man McLoyf, the god of drink and medicine, and he created the Estus flask. Nito was Gwyn's father-in-law, Velka's father. The Japanese language has three words for uncle, and the Japanese script of Dark Souls refers to Nito, implying the term that in this context means father-in-law. He was deified as Lloyd, and he invented the Undead Hunter charm, which used to be called Lloyd's talisman. This talisman serves as the inversion of the Estus flask, and was used to prevent the undead from healing. Havel was Velka's father-in-law, Gwyn's father, as evidenced by his name, which again refers to the calling of the dawn, to the birth of Gwyn, the Lord of Light, as well as by the descriptor of old men, which, in the context of the gods of Anorlondo, who were simply the deified members of royalty, denotes seniority over other such gods. Havel being deified with the name McLoyf, and having created the Estus flask, a medicinal drink, fitting to have been invented by the god of medicine and drink, serves to make him an inverse parallel to Nito. One ended up harming man to the benefit of the gods, the other ended up conspiring against the gods to the benefit of man. One is portrayed in gold, the color of the few, the other in copper, the color of the many. Nito helps to spread the curse of undead, going against his daughter's wishes, and Havel helps to undo the curse of undead, going against his son's wishes. Havel created the Estus flask by basing himself on his knowledge of the immortal ancient dragons, his enemies of old which he admired so much, who were now his allies. We find a miracle of Havel near the only surviving archdragon, after all. It is fitting that a man such as Havel would be the founding father, again, a reference to his patriarchal role as Gwyn's father, to a country that centers around the journey of undead. The pioneers, who landed on the southern shore, thoroughly explored the continent. They found a valley filled with a special mineral they would refine into an alloy that would be employed to create unusually durable equipment. Most notably, the weapons of the Hyde Knights, which natively deal lightning damage. When unalloyed, the metal that arrives from the ore is as black as the ore itself, a reference to the primordial energy of nature that is black, a combination of all colors, of all elements. Within the valley rested the reincarnated soul of an old one, the soul of Gwyn, the Lord of Light, which is the reason behind the presence of the dark and dense minerals, which resulted from the ichorous earth. Ichor being an ethereal fluid talked about in Greek myth, which flows through the veins of the gods. Though it also refers to the foul-smelling, watery discharge that can be found in wounds or ulcers, in classic From Software dualistic irony. The darkness of the ore is, indeed, emblematic of Gwyn's dualistic nature, and a reference to the dragons, Gwyn's enemies, who later inspired, due to his envy of them, his corruption into turning from Christ to Antichrist. And finally, it refers to the dichotomy between Gwyn's light exterior and his dark interior, for he was ultimately a man, and like any man, he was not immune to the temptation of the dark. In this context, the ichorous fluid is lava, and it used to flow abundantly through the valley. Indeed, near the valley was a vast range of volcanoes, which would expel their lava from their tops, a reference to Gwyn's empire at the upper realm. The lightning damage of the alloy that is made from the ichorous mineral is a reference to Gwyn's lightning miracles, which are stored within his soul's memory. Its impressive durability is a reference to Gwyn's desire to create an immortal empire which he would rule as an Antichrist-like figure. A city was erected near the valley. Its name would be Volgan, a name meaning to pursue, denoting ambition. Its architecture was inspired by an Orlando, for Havel hailed from there. The valley would be named Lanafir. In Japanese, Lao Canal, Lao meaning precious, beloved, darling, as well as garnet, ruby, and red, and Canal referring to the lava that used to flow through it. As the southeastern shore, they'd build a fortress that would serve both as a training ground for warriors and a way of defending that border against invaders. Enormous statues depicting fierce warriors were built to intimidate any foreign threat. At Heide's distant north, the pioneers met a miraculous sight, a nostalgic sea of stone pillars which housed dragons. That is, wyverns, their descendants, but nonetheless, it was a wonderful vision which inspired the king to build his castle there. Even more inspiring, however, was the dragon egg they found at its tallest peak. They built the castle alongside a shrine dedicated to dragon worship. The castle is the place that would later become known as Aldea's Manse, which is why it has been overtaken by moss and foliage when we reach it in the distant future. It was one of the first constructions built on Heide. The castle was adorned with sculptures of its king, Havel, a man wielding a sword and a scroll. The statue is directly based on the figure of Paul, the Christian apostle, who, in turn, is similar to Saul, a warrior king who stood for priestly violence. Both are Benjamites who are involved with human sacrifice, like Havel is involved with fire linking. Like Havel, who was, at first, a bishop of the Way of White, and killed Undead, the so-called agents of the dark, Paul kills the followers of Christ before his conversion to Christianity. Havel's epitaph, the Rock, has both the literal meaning and the symbolic of apostle. Havel was Gwyn's apostle, his right-hand man, when he was an archetypal Christ, who aspires to bring further gnosis to man. But after he became an Antichrist, Havel defected and became an adept of fire linking. Further in this connection, Rome, the place where Christianity first arose, was an empire founded by Romulus and Remus, the twins who were raised by wolves. Gwyn's most upstanding knight, Artorias, is represented by a wolf and made a wolf his friend, and we find statues that portray him in the later built Church of Blue, though the statues don't resemble him, for they abided by the revisionistic religion of the New World. Similarly, there's a statue of Velka that presents travelers to three paths, one of which leads to Havel's castle. Flowers represent flame. The flowers around her feet represents the first flame, and she caresses a flower, a reference to fire linking. Velka represents Sophia, the eon that is analogous to the human soul, and who champions knowledge. She is opposite to Gwyn, who represents the demiurge, Satan, though, superficially, she was a dark witch, and she did make a deal with the devil, with the serpents. She is both Sophia and Lilith, a dark figure. Gwyn, her counterpart, is both Christ, as he brought the dawn to mankind, and Antichrist, as he became a prince of darkness. Both Velka and Gwyn are dualistic figures, and there is a clear yin-yang dichotomy between them. The undead who become true kings mirror the King of Kings himself, and Gwyndolin, Havel's master, the King of the Gods, represents the alchemical Rebis, the perfect human being, like Christ, and it's worth reiterating that his inversion is the Antichrist, which Gwyn, the previous King of the Gods, represented. But in yet another display of dualism, Gwyndolin is a master manipulator, like the father of lies, Satan. The sword he wields is a reference to his clan's culture of brave warriors, and the scroll is a reference to his status as a bishop. Most interestingly, however, is the symbol of the samsara, the wheel of life, that is amply featured on the walls of the castle. It is a reference to the unending, miserable lives of the undead, as well as to the restoration of the natural cycle of day, night, and reincarnation that fire linking will bring. The Dragon Shrine was built to host and to honor the Dragon Egg, which, not by accident, looks like a Philosopher's Stone. As explained in my previous video, the dragons represents the prima materia, that is, the raw energy of nature itself, which is why they are the fusion of every animal, the whole creature. They were originally everlasting statues, for they are designed as embodiments of the Philosopher's Stone. Havel would further his studies of the dragons, ever expanding his admiration and reverence for them. He creates the Dragon Remnant's Covenant, which mirrors the Dragon Covenant of Dark Souls 1. I must again reiterate that we find a miracle of Havel near the Ancient Dragon, the Master of the Covenant. To imitate the dragons is to attempt to rid yourself of your mortality, to seek everlasting life, which is a sensible reason for the myriad of undead to aspire to join the covenants in question. Touching the scales of an ancient dragon gives one a glimpse into the abyss, for the primordial dragon statues were everlasting because they weren't alive yet. They didn't have souls within them, and thus, before the advent of fire, were purely dark. Ironically, to transcend life through becoming like the dragons is to lose it entirely. That is also why the weapons derived from the remains of the dragons do not scale with any stats. They bear no life within them, only manifesting the raw, like the infusion, which strips a weapon of its scaling and is represented by the image of a damp, dark hole, energy of nature. Those who aspire to become like the dragons would have to face a trial of might. The Drake Keepers, which were built with the dark mineral found in the Icaros Valley, serve as guards of the Dragon Shrine, and judges to those who want to conquer it and join the ranks of the Dragon Warriors. These automatons were inspired by the Iron Golem, a golem whose core was the remains of a dragon, and whose exterior was of black iron, black representing, as previously explained, the raw energy of nature, and whose duty was to judge the undead who wanted to conquer Sun's fortress. And as members of Havel's, that is, of Gwyn's clan, the Dragon Warriors respect the bravery and strength of worthy challengers, bowing to them as they pass their trials. Lydia, the leader of the second expedition, would land on the south of the continent as well. There, she built a fortress that would double as a school of magic inspired by Vinheim, the school gifted to Sif by Velka. The school would be named Melfia, which derives from the Greek word for honey being a symbol of enlightenment, as well as a reference to the matriarchal order of bee colonies, and the name Fia, which means wild and deer, an animal that represents innocence, and whose antlers represent resurrection. Her kingdom would be named Olafis, which is a name derived from Olaf that means descendants of the old, a reference to their ancestry. Olafis would revive the study of not only sorcery, but also of pyromancy, which was banned by Gwyn ever since the war against the demons. Its practitioners, royals of Karim, having been victims of a brutal witch hunt. In their exploration of the land, the scholars would find the Brightstone Cave and call it Tseldora, a combination of the world's jewel, as informed by the Japanese texts, and Dora, a name meaning gift. Within this cavern rests the reincarnated great soul of an old one, the soul of Sif, the Pale Drake, which is the reason behind the presence of the crystal-like, shiny minerals which bear concentrated souls within them. Surrounding the cave, a town of peasants, who would be employed as miners and farmers, was erected. The land used to be a barren wasteland, a desert, and so, commoners would be employed to create a vast underground system of artificial rivers to provide water for the denizens of the town, and fertilize the region's soil. The Brightstone would be employed to create the Staves of Wisdom, the best staves in the game, which feature an S scaling with intelligence. The absurd capacity of the unprocessed crystal to draw power from intelligence is a reference to Sif's search for knowledge, and its capacity to cast hex sorceries, spells that conjure water, dark, and only a thin layer of light, alongside regular sorceries, spells that conjure water and light, as exemplified by the Sunset Staves and by the Staves of Amana, is a reference to the dark nature of the ancient dragons. A city was built near the desert. Its name would be Forossa. Foro meaning forum in Latin and Rossa meaning red. Its architecture derives from that of Izalith, the kingdom of the Witches of Chaos. Within its territory, we find the Old Sun Ring, a ring that references in its texts, design, name, and even function the chaotic, parasitic son of Izalith. Its description reads: an odd stone ring containing a fiery heat. Accumulates power as the user is harmed, then explodes, damaging surrounding enemies while leaving its wearer unscathed. Our deeds will come back to us in some form or another, both good and bad. The ring's function is emblematic of the explosion, or rather, of the eruption triggered by the self-immolating ritual the witch performs to give birth to the bed of chaos. Notably, it only triggers as a reaction of self-defense, like how the witch gave rise to her parasitic, chaotic son in response to Gwyn's undead curse. Izalith means, as explained in the previous episode, land of stonemakers. It was within this forest that the reincarnated soul of an old one, of the witch of Izalith, was buried, which is the explanation behind the desertification of the land. The Great Soul manifests as the witch's thirst for power, acting like a demiurge, a parasite, sucking the life from the earth and its inhabitants and shrouding it in fog. A reference to the configuration of the world when flame first appeared at the earth's bosom, with water resting above, dissipated as fog. The result of a body from which the soul has been wholly extracted is petrification. The Great Soul residing below the earth, within the underworld, is also a reference to the empire of the witch, who wanted to recreate the first flame through sinful means. I will now analyze in depth the designs of the king and queen, of Havel and Lydia, which were delicately crafted and feature incredible detail. Havel has an immense beard, reflecting his deific title of Old Man. His sword also vaguely looks like an old man's cane, which is not only a symbol of old age and wisdom, but also of strength and resilience. His helmet looks like the hat of a pope, which is emblematic of his status as a priestly king. The waist piece of his armor features dragon scales, like the armor of his grandson Flann. His armor's color scheme represents the sunset, yet another symbol of old age, as well as a symbol for the ending of Gwyn's day, for the sequel to his Age of Fire. Around his neck is a mantle of crow feathers, denoting his affiliation to Velka and the Firelink conspiracy. Adorning his shield is a sword-like pattern that pierces a flower and an empty circle, the sun, whose rays can be seen shining below it, in a reference to the Firelink conspiracy. And as a final observation, his sword's pommel is a reference to his old helmet, to the cockerel's crest, which his loyal knights of old still wore in Heide. Lydia's mask is shaped like a crow beak and made from gold, an obvious reference to the mask of Velka, which was still used by her loyal followers of old in Heide. Atop her helmet is a pair of dragon wings, a reference to Velka's allegiance to the dragon's cause, though they also vaguely look like a deer's antlers. Her white cape is identical to that of Gwyndolin, a symbol of femininity, as well as a symbol of the four wings of the dragons, and of the butterflies, which are animals emblematic of moonlight. Adorning her neck covering is the leaf of the Way of Blue. The handle of her sword references the coiled swords of the bonfires, which are tools for the undead and instruments of firelinking created by Velka, who sacrificed herself to fuel the first bonfire with her ashes. Her small shield portrays the face of a suffering undead, a reference to Kaita, the goddess of tears, the new name Velka is known for in Heide, which is more closely associated with her nurturing facet, thus dimensioned by the tearstone rings, which represents the tears she shed for the accursed. The shield is also a chime, a reference to both the bells of awakening, which are integral to the undead prophecy, as well as to the bells that call undead from their graves to link the fire. Her chest piece is also vaguely shaped like a bell. Behind the capes, the skirt, and the armor are dark clothing. The color scheme of her set is representative of the moon, of its light, and of the night. The two countries became close allies to each other, hence their leaders, Havel and Lydia, would marry to cement their political alliance, much like Gwyn and Velka marries to each other to cement theirs. Heide was a continent united under one banner and under one objective, that being to link the fire. The symbol adopted by the alliance portrays their ambition. Two imposing dragons stand before a flower that is pierced by a sword. The two dragons are a reference to Kaf and Frampt. The Firelink conspiracy operates through an alliance between man and dragon, which seeks to restore the natural cycle of the world and undo the curse that was cast upon it. They share a mutual interest. For man wants to get rid of the curse of undead, and the dragons wants to empower themselves, which they can't do if the world is stagnant. The image of the two dragons is an evolution of the symbol of the two serpents, their transformed, whole selves, which is more directly based on Kaf and Frampt, who represents duality but serve the same goal, just like Havel and Lydia. As previously explained, the sword that pierces the flower is a reference to the Firelink conspiracy. After all, the sun is symbolically pierced by the coiled sword, which extracts its fire to fuel the recreated first flame. The two dragons are linked to Lydia, and the sword that pierces the flower is to Havel. Thus, the crest of Heide means the establishment of a new world, guided by firelinking under the union of opposites. It esoterically references the alchemical magnum opus as the macrocosm, the Rebis, which is the male and the female conjoined into one being that is empowered by the dragon. The king and queen built a castle, which would serve to host the throne of the King of Kings, of the one who will link the fire, of the one who would become a true king through martyrdom, like Jesus Christ. The path to the throne is a straight line, adorned with giant candles that illuminates the deep, dark abyss surrounding it, a reference to occult knowledge and to the first flame, and the throne itself is like a kiln of ash, for the king who sits on it will burn and become the supreme martyr, the truest of kings. It is the new world's kiln of the first flame, the flame that rests below the surface of the world and that opposes the sun, though the throne would be a later development. At this point in the timeline, only the castle was built. The castle would serve as a final test to the Firelinkers, a trial of mice that filters those with souls unfit to fuel the recreated first flame. Firelinking in itself is a reference to achieving gnosis. Souls are composed primarily of light, and thus, the one with a supreme soul, a soul fit to link the fire, achieves enlightenment. The soul memory mechanic is directly based on this. After all, memories are themselves souls. Only an undead with a high enough soul memory can open the gates to this climactic test, which, superficially, in the realm of the material, also serves as an assessment of strength. The place that hosts the gates is called Shrine of Winter, for firelinking aims to advance the cycle, putting an end to Gwyn's summer, which means the coming of fall, as symbolized by the Way of Blue's falling leaves, and later of winter. The king and queen would both sit on a throne to rule over the continent from this castle. The dominant religion of their empire was the Way of Blue, a subversion of the Way of White. The Way of White was the religion founded by Gwyn to spread the curse of undead. Its maidens would revive the deceased, producing undead, and its paladins would conduct undead hunts which would spread the plague of undeath. The Way of White means the way towards a new dawn. The religion was created by Gwyn in response to the endless night that threatened his rule. The Way of Blue, in contrast, is a religion that aims to undo the curse, and so its paladins, the Blue Sentinels, act as protectors to journeying undead. The Way of Blue is, in fact, more akin to a humble prayer spread amongst those who seek help in their firelinking odysseys. It's not a coincidence that upon reaching the final rank of the Way of Blue, the undead is awarded with a blue tearstone ring, a ring created by Velka, whose nurturing facet is now called Kaita, the goddess of tears, which symbolizes the tears she sheds for the cursed, and that protects those closest to death. The Way of Blue means the way toward a new night. The religion was created by Gwyndolin, the inheritor of Velka's will, and Gwyn's successor as king of the gods, in response to the endless day that was caused by the curse. That is made even more blatant by Dark Souls 3's iteration of the Covenant, whose symbol is a blue waxing crescent moon. In Dark Souls 2's case, its symbol is a leaf, a reference to the fall which firelinking will bring as Gwyn's summer fades. The Blue Sentinels are a continuation of Gwyndolin's Order of Knights, the Knights of the Dark Moon. They punish the guilty in accordance with Velka's law and protect the beneficiaries of the Accord of the Way of Blue. As opposed to the Way of White, a religion that hunted the meekest among men, the Way of Blue protects them. The Blue Sentinels would also have power over commerce, as a means of ensuring that bad actors wouldn't prosper and harm their cause. Before the expeditions had been initiated, an accord was made by both leaders with the King of the Gods, Gwyndolin. They would forbid the uttering of the names of the old gods in the New World they were set to discover. This measure was taken to facilitate the subversion of the faith of the undead. The religion of Heide would worship new gods, though all of them were based on figures from Lordran. Gwyndolin also instructs them to proliferate the new faith of the Way of Blue, and ordained many of the pioneers, his Blue Sentinels. Havel, the king, orders the construction of the Heide's Tower of Flame alongside the Church of Blue. The Tower of Flame served as the lighthouse that directed undead from foreign lands to Heide. They'd orient their ships to follow its light, which shone brightly on the ice that surrounded the continent. As they reached Heide through an underground port and left its underworlds to gas to the surface, they'd miss the sunset, with the tower losing its contrast with its surroundings. The area around the Tower of Flame deliberately parallels Orlando in its configuration. We must defeat waves of golems who act as guards and reach the cathedral, the Church of Blue, that hosts the last trial, a silver clone of Dragonslayer Ornstein that conjures the dark, a reference to that which the contender for the throne must face, who must be defeated by the bearer of the curse. Aspiring Blue Sentinels has to undergo this microcosmic reenactment of the journey of the chosen undead to join the ranks of the Order. The men who joined the Blue Sentinels were ordained Knights of Heide, and were, ironically, gifted suits of armor forged from the alloy made from Gwyn's reincarnated soul, and thus were extremely durable, as well as weapons, which were imbued with lightning, a property sourced from the memory of Gwyn's bolts of lightning. Statues of Gwyn, with his head replaced by that of a falcon, a symbol of the sun, and a reference to the sun god Ra of Egyptian mythology, were sculpted to adorn this trial of strength in reference to the ancient customs that derived from Gwyn's clan of warriors. Gwyn's clan espoused a warrior culture among its members. Its leaders were chosen by their strength. Gwyn was a warrior king who fought against the dragons on the front lines. Havel, the founding father of the country named after him, kept the tradition of his culture alive. Havel would order the excavation of an underground graveyard to host the remains of the challengers who failed their quests. They'd be sanctified through death, for they gave their lives to the cause of firelinking. Thus, the cemetery would earn the name Grave of Saints. To avoid the spread of the curse, Havel would make an accord with the Red King who lived below. The men would rule over the surface, and the rats would be allowed to rule the underworld. This made it so the dead would have their souls petrified and then eaten by the rats, whose bite inflicts petrification, preventing accursed sparks of souls from drifting to the overworld and contaminating men. The statues of rats holding pots are in reference to their role as those who contain the curse. The foreigners who wished to undergo the trials and become true kings by linking the fire would settle near the southern coast and build a small village, Majula, its name meaning to progress. A monument would be built in the honor of the countless deaths of brave undead, a monument that looks like the Christian cross and like the coiled sword of the bonfires. Near the monument was a stone engraved with a covenant, a reference to the biblical commandments, which were engraved on stone. This covenant, the Company of Champions, would transpose the souls it received from its members in the form of all stones to their worlds, making their journeys more difficult, with the purpose of enriching their souls, for suffering sanctifies the Christian man. The Champion epitaph is a metaphor for apostle, like the name Peter, which means stone, like the stone that hosts the covenant. Lydia, the queen, orders the construction of the Shrine of Amana, alongside the Undead Crypt. The Shrine of Amana is the place that would serve to beckon those close to dying to find their deathbeds. For this purpose, the scholars created the Nito, female homunculi, who share a lack of individuality, their only function being to sing a beautiful lullaby to both attract and soothe the departing, alongside the bright bugs, which in turn serve that same function. They'd be made to wear rings of the dead to hide their corpse-like appearances as to make them look pleasing to the undead they served. Their song would also serve to soothe the deformed creature that lied dormant in the caves, a being referred to as a demon, though not one born out of the bed of chaos, but of the organic remains of deceased dragons, destroyed archtrees, and dead men who fought against the dragons thousands of years before, when they ruled as one sole continent, like the sanctuary guardian of Forossa. Upon waking up, the creature develops the habit of eating men, for it felt incomplete, like every other greedy descendant of the ancient dragons. The creature is shaped like a frog, as the other aquatic-like or amphibian-like life forms birthed by the remains of the dragons, for they are related to water and dark, as they hail from an age before fire and light had appeared. Its exoskeleton is nearly impervious to damage, as it derives from a mixture of the stone scales of the dragons with the stone wood of the archtrees. Its interior, however, betrays its human part. It took the shape of a frail hollow, of a frowning dead man with large hands that know only to hunt and grab its feed. Its primitive, instinct-based nature is reflected by its design, which references the sensory homunculus, a visual representation of how man's basic senses perceive his own being. The Undead Crypt would serve as the resting place for all, and it doubled as a mechanism for enforcing the rule of fire linking. The effigies made for the dead were connected to bells that would toll to awake the slumbering man when needed. It's worth noting that souls are also associated with sound. Bells and chimes are particularly powerful tools of soul resonation. A strong enough bell is even capable of summoning a soul from afar. An identical mechanism would be employed in the distant future for the same purpose. In Dark Souls 1, miracles were conjured through talismans, for the talismans drew their power from the sun above. In Dark Souls 2, chimes are often employed as catalysts, for they were created when the night reigned above, and the fire was in the underworld as a result of fire linking, and so Nito is to be beckoned by sound. The crypt is replete with imagery that depicts Velka as a motherly figure to the dead, not unlike what her father, Nito, used to be. He was the Allfather of the dead. There is also a statue with a candle attached to her head. Again, candles are a symbol of occult knowledge. The statue can be lit to grant light to the crypt in reference to gnosis. The Finito, the male counterparts to the Milfanito, were homunculi made from the dead created to serve as guards of the crypt. They were instructed to attack under the smallest hint of light, as to avoid disturbing the dead. Only with a queen's decree would one be allowed to operate the crypt. The great sword wielded by Agdain, the leader of the Finito, his name deriving from Abdullah, which means servant of God, features a dark sun as its pommel. A creation myth was invented to orient the pale homunculi about their purpose. They were, as the story goes, made by Nito, though his name is absent from the story, for uttering the names of the old gods of Lordran is forbidden. To weave death and watch over the dead, in the case of the Finitos, and to sing the appeasing song, in the case of the Milfanitos. They were also told of Kaf's version of the events that preceded the first game, and believe it to be the truth. The makers of the homunculi servants of the crypt, the Lydia witches and apostles, would reside there, taking care of the place and of the dead within it. Those two construction projects inversely mirror each other, with one serving as a trial of combats to the undead, and the other serving as their tranquil resting place. One implies Gwyn as its guardian deity, the warrior king who watches over the challengers as they prove their valor, and the other implies Velka, the witch who watches over the dead as they rest in peace. The two kingdoms, Havel and Olafis, made a joint effort to produce a rebis. Havel had a culture of golem making, and Olafis a homunculi making one. They'd combine their knowledge to create a magnum opus. For that aim, they'd conduct experiments on humans. Again, like those Sif had performed to create Gwyndolin, which produced grotesque creatures. The first experiment resulted in the birth of the beings who would later be known as Flexile Sentries, the conjoined lizard men. The second experiment resulted in a two-headed spider, whose exoskeleton became as hard as a rock. Tark, a warrior from Havel, whose name ironically means smart, wise, and knowledgeable. And Najka, a sorceress from Olafis, whose ironic name is a combination of Naj, meaning elegance or gracefulness, with Jika, which means if or when, as in a conditional statement, as well as to change, to transform. Used to be a pair of lovers who desires to become one being, and so volunteer to become the Rebis, the union of male and female empowered by the dragon. Both were transformed into chimeric beings, not unlike the chaotic demons of old. For the dragons represents the primordial chaos, and the demons are their artificial imitations. This is why their designs mirror those of Islif's Spider-Woman. They failed to become the Rebis, and would tragically turn on each other in the future. A subtle allusion to Gwyn and Velka's marriage, as Tark is a warrior and Najka is a sorceress. They sentenced themselves to eternal damnation, as one can't harm the other, for their souls were linked in the ritual. Like the Milfanitos and the Finitos, Tark and Najka, when reborn as misshapen homunculi, with no memories, were told that their creator was the legendary Sif, the grandfather of sorcery. A lie, for Sif, like Nito, had already been killed ages before. Finally, the extensive research of the alchemists bore fruit. An angelic being, which combines both masculine and feminine features, and was empowered by the dragons, was created. His design features a hood very similar to those worn by the Lydians who created and managed the Undead Crypt, and his skin is blue like that of a Nito, denoting he, much like them, was made from the dead. His nails are black, further indicating this origin. He has angel-like wings, as well as a flowing bluish skirt. Both features are references to Sif, the Pale Drake. It's possible the essence of the dragons was taken from both the petrified egg of Havel and from the bright stone of Allfather, which hosted Sif's very soul within it. Furthermore, his organic-looking dress is made from bluish-white scales that look like feathers, or perhaps vice versa. He has 4 arms, which symbolize divinity in Hindu and Buddhist iconography. 4 arms are a symbol of the 4 cardinal directions, the 4 corners of the universe, a subtle callback to the 4 kings, which used to rule over Astora, the Middle Earth of Lordran, the first kingdom to be afflicted by the Undead curse, and the first to succumb to the temptation of the Abyss. His cloning ability is a further connection to the Abyssal Kings, as well as the name he would be called in the future, Darklurker. He is capable of summoning a portal to cast spells from that looks like the Eclipse, and like the Dark Sign, as both are mirrors to each other in the macro and microcosm. He can conjure the 4 elements with his magic, like Gwyndolin, for both are the Rebis, the perfect alchemical creations. In fact, his teleporting magic is a reference to his predecessors. And finally, the middle section of his skirt looks like a uterus, which is yet another side to Gwyndolin, whose skirt's middle section represents menstruation, as informed by the developers in an interview. The alchemical magnum opus was tasked with a duty from his inception. He would sacrifice himself in a ritual to produce a fire-linking kiln in the New World, like Velka has done in Lordran. Every bonfire is created from the remains of undead, through their sacrifice. Thus, the greatest of bonfires must be created from the remains of a great being. Interestingly, the ritual to summon the Darklurker as a pilgrim of the dark involves lighting 3 symbolic bonfires in the underworld, each representing one failed king of the New World, which Vendrick was asked to slay before his downfall. Both the king and the queen would escort him to the chamber, where the ritual would be performed, and the couple would abdicate their own thrones to forever watch over and defend the throne of Ash, waiting for a successor to challenge them and prove himself worthy of becoming a true king. They'd face the contenders to the throne as a pair, each protecting and healing the other in a dance fitting for 2 lovers. The Titanite golems that were in place to build the castle would rest until a fitting sovereign appeared before them. Should the time come, they'd awaken from their deep slumber. Their hollowed cores would automatically activate when a gleaming soul came close to them, and carve the path to the throne. The end of Havel and Allfather was both imminent and inevitable. As nature itself is cyclical, so is man's role. With both king and queen absent, insurrections ensued. Without the pair of wise rulers in power, mankind fell to propaganda and superstition. What followed was the first war of the New World, the war that would bring instability and destruction to Heide's civilization. The names Havel, Allfather, and Heide would soon be lost. As the southeast, half of Havel's territory, the Heide Knights would betray their order and subvert their role as Blue Sentinels by starting crusades against the Undead, spreading the curse and obstructing fire-linking. They'd become like the paladins of the old way of white, seeking a new dawn to send away the endless night. Undead hunts are based on the medieval crusades. The great helms associated with the Christian Crusaders were the historical reference that informs the design of the helms worn by the Heide Knights. The rest of their set also resembles those that were worn by the Crusaders. Their crusade ended where it had started. Its climax was an attempt to invade the Church of Blue, but they were evenly matched by the Old Knights, the artificial sentinels of the Tower of Flame, and went hollow before they could conquer the cathedral. The Heide Knights had attracted the soul of Nito, which rested below them. They were possessed by the soul, which emboldens their desire to conduct the hunts and spreads death. The paladins of the Way of White operated under Nito's orders, who was secretly Allfather Lloyd, furthering the parallel. The Church of Blue, along with the residential area that surrounded it, and the Grave of Saints, would be submerged in the sea, for the consequence of the Crusades was a great flood, which is symbolic for plunging mankind into the abyss. Water is adjacent to dark because it sinks, unlike fire, which ascends. This phenomenon can be explained through an understanding of the Aristotelian configuration, the nature of the world of Dark Souls operates under. The self-inflicted Great Flood of Havel is a reference to the flood of the Old Testament, a punishment by God cast upon men for their sins, which, in the context of Dark Souls 2, were the Crusades themselves. This great reset would mark the beginning of a dark age, where men's hearts would be conquered by the curse, and they'd become unenlightened, like the Pygmies, their primordial ancestors. They would turn hollow. The raging war would spread the curse throughout the lands, and men were desperate to contain it. Havel had resorted to literally throwing its greedy undead, the adjective denoting thieves, murderers, and cannibals, down the gutter. For each person who'd be disposed of this way, they sculpted a stone effigy of Velka, the mother of the forlorn, a small gesture of penitence for their deed, as well as a way of asking for mercy to the cursed. The grave of saints would be defiled by the distressed acts of men. It was once a sacred graveyard designed to bring a dignified rest to the brave men who martyred themselves, but was now the improvised trash can of a decaying empire. The undesirables would build a slum within the underworld, where they would live in agony and solitude for ages to come. The similarities between the gutter and Dark Souls 1's Blightstown extends to the habits of their denizens. We find many cannibals and bandits in both areas. After all, the more one hollows, the more one desires for holiness, and the more one acts on impulse, and so, the meekest among the undead would naturally be driven to such crimes. Even men's best friends weren't safe from the effects of the curse, and those that became man-eaters were disposed of alongside their owners. The gutter is better navigated with the use of a torch, for its light illuminates the dark, a metaphor for knowledge illuminating ignorance. The inhabitants of the gutter, hollows, men who were reduced to their primitive forms, worship the faded bonfires which the bearer of the curse should light throughout his journey to conquer the slum. Said bonfires had been lit before the protagonist travels to the gutter by a man named Pharros, who parallels the bearer of the curse, but their fires gradually gave in to dark, a metaphor for the fading of the first flame as fire linking is abandoned by men. The hollows of the gutter kept worshipping the dead bonfires, for they still yearned for their warmth, but lacked the noses they needed to move on. Effigies of Velka, which protects them from invaders, were placed near the bonfires. The Red King was displeased by this development, for men had broken their ancient accord by settling in the world below. He would declare war against them and antagonize any trespassers to his territory. A vast portion of the country formerly known as Havel was buried in the deep, damp abyss. A part of what remained of it, the place where Volgen is situated, would then be called Alken, or rather, Arken, as informed by the Japanese text, which means worship. The northeast, half of the territory of Olafis, would rebel against firelinking as well, as its scholars, who had been dabbling into the study of the dark arts for a long time, fell to the temptation of the abyss. They'd begin by corrupting the holy man, while secretly disposing of those who weren't corruptible. The holy man was then convinced the commoners, who, like the rest of Heide, had fallen prey to the curse, to join the wicked cause, promising them eternal life. The Warlocks would enchant the farming and mining tools of the peasants with a hex that granted them life-draining properties, a direct tie to Life Drain, the art created by Kaf, which he had granted to the Dark Wraiths. As the howling peasants kills their fellow men to absorb their life energy, like microcosmic demiurges, they help to spread the dark. The plot of the Hexers mirrors those of the primordial serpent Kaf, who tempted the four kings as well as the sorcerers of Ulasil to insurrect. The Warlocks coordinated their takeover with the Duke who ruled over Tseldora. The Duke was an eccentric man who has developed an obsession with the creatures he found deep in Brightstone Cove, that is, the spiders. The spiders are, like all animals, incomplete dragons. In times of old, when the alliance between Havel and Olafis was in its heyday, the two kingdoms had attempted to produce Erebus. They did eventually succeed, but along the way, there were many failed experiments. Freja, the two-headed spider named after the Norse goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and magic, was among them. The Duke of Tseldora kept her as a pet. Freja would be freed from her cage and fed a chunk of the great soul of the pale drake, causing the spider to grow immensely. The Duke would then betray his people and unleash his dear Freja and its kin upon them, and the spiders would devour all men in the mining town. The Duke had been gradually possessed by a chunk of Sif's reincarnated soul, which is the reason for his morbid, nefarious curiosity. Or perhaps it was the soul that had desires to possess that man for his curious character. Within Tseldora is a hole of quicksand. It references the hunting practices of the ant lions, insects that, similarly to butterflies, undergo an intense metamorphosis. They go from ant to dragonfly. Freja wished to undergo metamorphosis from spider to dragon. Volgen would use its coin to hire mercenaries to combat the forces of the Dark and conquer Tseldora. The Falconers, who ended up reaching a stalemate against the peasants who guarded the entrance to the town, for both sides would be drained by the curse. However, this clash was a victory for the Warlocks, for they succeeded in extracting the souls of both their adversaries and of the men they had fooled, and both groups were conjoined into one army of hollows, which the Hexters would manipulate to their advantage, to spread the curse. As a result of the proliferation of the plague, a vast portion of the country of Olafis was buried in the deep, damp abyss. The southeast of Olafis, where Amalfia is situated, would become Venn, or rather, Vain, as informed by the Japanese texts. Amidst the unending war, the Prince of Alken, Havel's successor, and the Princess of Venn, Lydia's successor, would cultivate a forbidden romance. They'd love each other so dearly they'd order the construction of a secret meeting place within their respective territories. The Prince of Alken built the Belfry Sol, and the Princess of Vain built the Belfry Luna. When one of the lovers rings their bell, the soul of the other would resonate with the sound and be beckoned by it. The tolling of the bell was a summoning ritual for the couple to meet in hiding. To guard their secret, the lovers would create puppets with the ancient arts they had inherited from their predecessors, and task them with protecting the bells. After all, if someone else rang the bell, their respective lover would be summoned, and their forbidden relationship would be leaked, which would result in tragedy. They named the original puppet Tichigren, meaning very small branch, in reference to his tiny stature, and subsequently they made a couple dozen reproductions, to further protect the belfries. The princess would sculpt gargoyles and animate them, tasking them with watching over her bell, a callback to Dark Souls 1's belfry gargoyles, and to the Witch of Izalith who sculpted them, and the prince would use his vast wealth to hire mercenaries to watch over his bell. Alken's capital was Volgen, a city known for its abundant wealth. Eventually, both would be forced to take part in arranged marriages, and both would inherit their nation's thrones. The eastern country of Forossa, whose territory extended from the eastern half of the Shaded Woods to the great castle north of the Shrine of Winter, was not only facing a war against its neighbors, but also an internal war against the great soul of the Witch of Chaos, which had been sucking the souls of its land like an envious, parasitic demiurge. Those who aspired to reach the ranks of war priest and sage would embark on a difficult pilgrimage to the distant north as to both strengthen their souls by its curse, which was full of icy demons, and prove their worth upon their return. Those who successfully completed that journey would be called Northwarders. The war gods they worshipped was Faram, Gwyn's firstborn, though his original, uncorrupted name was Flan, and the armor of the Lion Knights. The lion being a reference to the symbol of Gwyn's ancient clan, featured a depiction of him fighting an archdragon. According to the principles they attributed to their war god, even a peasant would be recognized and rewarded with ascension to the higher ranks of their society for his strength, diligence, and determination. Both the warriors and the sorcerers of Forossa fought like berserkers. They'd become famous for their ferocity on the battlefield. The swordsmen were agile and relentless, and the spellcasters would trade quantity for quality, for their staves cut possible casts in half in exchange for power. The men of Forossa were raised for war, and the Mists war, and could not even imagine other ways of living. The weapons and armor wielded by them were crafted from a special alloy, Steel. The alloy enables the forging of supernaturally lightweight equipment, some of which even increases their owner's dexterity, vitality, and endurance, for its unique property of lacking souls within it, a product of the curse cast upon the land by the great soul of the witch, which drains the energy of everything it could grasp. Eventually, the threat of the old chaos, of the great soul which rested below them, would prove overwhelming, and so they'd be forced to send their strongest warrior along with a company of knights and scholars to the distant north, where they'd build Ilium Lois, a city designed to quell the chaos. This effort would severely weaken the forces of their mainland, forcing the country to make an alliance. The warrior king of Forossa would marry Vane's queen. The main rival of Forossa was Jugo, a country of both warriors and pyromancers which was situated within the western half of the same desert-like land, the Shaded Ruins. Its heroic founder was a man named Aurous, a reference to the dawning sun of their territory. The design of his armor is quite significant. It portrays a connection to Havel's clan. The helmet is adorned with the rays of the dawn, and its visor opening is shaped like a sword, both features referencing the ancient Havel clan, whose crest bore a sword, and whose equipment depicts the sun's rays. Even the color scheme of the armor of Aurous resembles that of Havel. Adorning the belts of the set are metallic suns. Around the neck are various protruding spikes forming a circular pattern, a reference to an arena, a staple of the culture of the world of Dark Souls. More specifically, to the culture of Gwyn's, that is, to Havel's clan. Aurous' equipment was forged from Bastille, the unnaturally lightweight alloy that derives from a mineral abundant in the east, which is why it has the special ability of reducing equip load. Jugo is a name that references the Mediterranean wind that blows from the Sahara deserts. It also derives from Jugo, a Japanese name that, depending on the way it's written, may mean courage, overpowering, masculine, or gentleness. The combination of those various meanings is the perfect summary of the newly founded kingdom. The connection to the Mediterranean winds of the Sahara Desert denotes both Jugo's Mediterranean character, as well as the desert it stands upon. The warriors of Jugo thought of themselves as embodiments of courage and masculinity. However, somewhat unbeknownst to them, it was the women who were in charge. The desert magi are pyromancers who possess such bewitching beauty, they charm even the men who are aware of their dark intentions. Said beauty comes from their habit of absorbing men's lives through life drain, like dark raves. Their kiss of death is a direct reference to that of the Dark Knights. For as much as the warriors of Jugo praise masculinity, they paradoxically draw their strength from the powers of the esoteric feminine, for their armors, which are, ironically enough, said to be invisible to cowards, are enchanted with a spell of invisibility, presumably the work of Velka's and Gwyndolin's servants, as Velka is a deity associated with powers of invisibility, and Gwendolyn is the god of illusion. The illusory rings the warriors of Jugo wear, which turn their weapons invisible, are yet another example of that paradox. Indeed, they are courageous and strong, as betrayed by the method of obtaining the illusory rings, which for one of them is to beat Dark Souls 2 without dying once, and for the other is to beat it without resting on any bonfire. But they employ tactics most men on the battlefield would consider cheap and cowardly. As previously mentioned, it was the women of Jugo who were truly in control. The male warriors who fought for them were sacrificed as pawns, fighting on the front lines. They'd quickly hollow and be thrown down the gutter, while the magi would thrive through the art of life drain, becoming even more beautiful, never aging nor hollowing. The desert magi would craft grotesque-looking pots and enchant them with life drain. The pots would cast a curse upon those who come near them, which would absorb their souls. Even their own countrymen are targets for the vampiric pyromancers. Their behavior mirrors the very curse of the soul that rested within their soil. Jugo was a kingdom founded by a Dark Lord from Lordran, who was instructed by the primordial serpents to journey to the New World in search of more power. Aurous, the founder, wished to free his fellow men of the curse and call upon a new dawn. He'd seen that the previous generations of Firelinkers had failed in their quest of restoring the time of day, the Age of Fire, and he supposed they were too weak to feel the sun. He concluded he should seek even more souls to become greater than his predecessors. Of course, he was fooled by the scheme of the rogue deity, Velka, and by Gwyndolin's lies. He was fooled by the propaganda that claims that by linking the fire, one is following Gwyn's will of prolonging the Age of Fire, when, in truth, the opposite occurs. The illusory rings of Jugo reference the journey of its founder, a brave man who fulfilled his duty as the chosen undead. Ironically, Aurous was a member of Solar's Covenant, the Warriors of the Sun, and he has to summon fellow undeads to conquer Lordran, as he was too weak to do so on his own. Thus, while he and his warriors compensate for their lack of strength with bravado and relentlessness, Aurous mirrors the failed monarchs who came after him, powerful warriors who fell for the seduction of beautiful women, who embodies the abyss. Just like, in the macrocosm, the undead are prey to the curse, the men of Jugo are prey to the desert magi, who embody the curse, the allure of darkness. The desert magi parallel the daughters of Manus, who, through their femininity, seduce kings into the dark path. Aurous is also a reference to Sauron, the Dark Lord of the Rings. Besides his armor set looking astoundingly similar, and him being a Dark Lord, his rings provide powers of invisibility, like the One Ring. The ruined land of Havel southwest was occupied by a group of undead, who would go on to name their newly acquired territory Mirrah, a name deriving from Mirrah, meaning to see, in reference to the Tower of Flame, the lighthouse which stood as its landmark. Mirrah extends from the Sunset Realms, which are represented by the shield wielded by their knights, which encompass the Tower of Flame and the Cardinal Tower, to the Sunless Realms, which are represented by the armor worn by their knights, which features black and blue pieces on its exterior and upper half, and white and reddish-brown cloth on its lower half, symbols of the night sky and the first flame respectively, which encompass the place later known as Huntsman Copse. There, stone domes with holes only in their roofs, through which the hollowing undead were thrown, were designed to serve as inescapable prisons, to hold the undead until their souls faded into obscurity, having moved towards the sun, which that land lacked. The warriors of Mirrah refers to as orthodox, for they are like the undead hunters of the ancient way of white, would employ the holy water that hailed from the spring which was situated at the western end of their territory to produce both divine blessings and holy water urns, throwables which are designed to harm hollows. That spring bathed in the sunlight of the sun they erected through mass death. The campaigns waged by Mirrah were undead hunts, and in the distant future, the swords wielded by their knights would even develop a special proclivity to hurt hollows, thus earning the name Hollowslayers. Mirrah would train their warriors to become agile and strong swordsmen, only dabbling in spellcasting as long as it was useful to counter spellcasters themselves. They'd find the lost miracle scrolls of Havel, the Magic Barrier and the Great Magic Barrier, which they would teach to their knights, a title claimed only by those who had distinguished themselves on the battlefield. Some among their ranks would wear masks to hide their hollowing faces, for Mirrah was deeply afflicted by the curse, and so those close to losing themselves were exiled. Tragically, by the time the peasants who had finally managed to prove their valor after countless battles earned knighthood, they'd be suffering profusely from the effects of the dark sign. The meritocracy championed by Mirrah was but a deceitful ploy to spin the wheel of death, which would, when painfully turned, grant the desired sunlight to their homeland. Mirrah is inspired by 16th century Spain, and their undead hunts, which also serves to expand their domain by the Spanish conquistas. Mirrah would quickly become allies to Venn, for both nations opposed sorcerers and wished to combat the curse of undead, though both were misguided, for they were ignorant about how the dark sign operates. Venn had to reform Melfia into a prison complex to host the undead, the place that was once the greatest magic school of Heide, a symbol of man's sapience, of their quest for knowledge and emancipation, would have its purpose inverted, serving to jail the hollow husks of decaying men. The king who ruled over it, the Pharrosan warrior king who had married the queen of Venn, and who earned the moniker Jailer, would antagonize sorcerers, thinking them to be the progenitors of the curse, a reference to Sif having been the curse's creator, a historical fact which may have been diluted by rumor. Only pyromancers would be allowed within the Bastille, and its guards would all be practitioners of the arts. Sorcery would become a taboo, and those who studied it would be targets of the king's inquisition. This exaggerated measure mirrors Gwyn's witch hunt, which targeted the pyromancers of the world of men. However, it didn't stop men from studying sorcery in secret, as implied by the presence of the Bone Staff, a staff made from animal bones by a self-taught sorcerer, within a secret chamber of the Bastille. The undead who were stored as a prison would have their eyes covered with bandages. The foolish king thought that by sealing the windows to their souls, the curse would be physically halted, but it only made it so their hearts would be overwhelmed by the draining of the dark sign. As their inner fire felt the intense pressure of the sun's pulling, their chests would become like ticking bombs. The undead were such an issue that the king overlooked any cruelty committed against them. One of the prison's officials develops the habit of feeding them to dogs, but in the long term it resulted in the dogs themselves hollowing, and his spirit would forever haunt his torture yards. The desperate and paranoid jailer king had an idea. He'd find the fable's dark soul and harvest its powers to cure the curse of undead. He ordered a company of knights, the ones later known as Ruin Knights, to travel to the elusive Ringed City and steal it. But they would never come back, for they were defeated by the Judicator Giants and had their souls enslaved for eternity. Upon their departure, the king would commission Strayed, a sorcerer of ancient Alphys who had finally returned from his travels. to employ the art of puppetry to grant life to the armors that had remained, creating the golems that would be known as ruined sentinels. The mission of his knights was a secret, for the king didn't want the prisoners and enemies to know he had sent them away, and so the golems would stand as their replacements. The ruined sentinels were tasked with guarding the chamber which connects the prison area to the rest of the Bastille. After Straight had finished animating the sentinels, the Mad King would trap him in the Bastille, as he was a sorcerer, and all sorcerers are suspected of being agents of the dark. Straight of Olafis and Gilia of Volgan were two of the most prodigal scholars of Heide. Both were cosmopolites who traveled around the lands to attain knowledge. Straight has developed an art similar to that of the Pale Drake of yore. He could transpose the memories of the soul. He shared his discovery with his countrymen, which is why Moglin and Ornifex, natives to Tseldora, which belongs to Olafis, can use it. He is also the man who created the Staves of Wisdom from Brightstone. Gilia has developed an art identical to that of the heretical sorcerers of yore, the hexes. He wouldn't share it with anyone, so his hexes would have to be rediscovered by future generations of scholars who wanted to study the dark. When the war between Havel and Olafis started, Straight was away from his homeland. He'd only returned when Olafis was no more, and Venn had taken its place. Gilia was similarly absent from his homeland when the war started. Upon his return, he was exiled from the continent, for the King of Alken suspected all practitioners of the dark arts to be servants of the Abyss. Gilia would swear to enact revenge upon his homeland, but he would be forgotten by history, as he didn't take apprentices. As he drifted aimlessly through the sea, he'd stumble upon an island which had been, when the world was condensed in one piece of land, during the Age of Ancients, a battleground of a war which men had fought against the dragons, and thus contains the ultimate treasure, an abundance of titanite slabs. Venn's prison would become so crowded, they'd devise a mechanism to sink masses of undead into the sea. They'd build a special wooden ship that was designed to gradually sink as it left the underground port, which would become known as No Man's Wharf for this very reason. The ship would be filled with accursed men who'd be met with a Flexile Sentry, a failed Rebis who'd cut the undead to shreds and smash them with barbed clubs until they hollowed completely. And when that happened, their bodies, which had been emptied of light, and thus were no more than material husks, would sink to the bottom of the sea. The ship was conducted automatically by a magic spell, after it had sunk deep, and every passenger had been transported to the depths of the sea. A bell would be rung to signal to the automatic ship to return to the port. The port was operated by a company of slave warriors. Known as Varangians, they used to be a band of pirates. They had invaded the continent, and assaulted the territory that used to belong to the nation named Olafis. Their invasion failed, and they were enslaved by the king, who employs them as guards and officers of the No Man's Wharf. The port would be confronted by waves of invaders, many of them groups of bandits who aimed to pillage the lands, but all of them would be bested by the slave warriors. The battles often destroys the port's buildings, which has to be restored by the Varangians, who employs the carcasses of the ships and boats of the invaders to fix the damage. Its bell in particular was knocked down and put back together many, many times. The Jailer King would become increasingly mad, as each of his attempts of combating the curse would only serve to weaken his kingdom. The prison he'd created ended up contributing to the proliferation of the plague in the long term, for confinement accelerates the loss of oneself. His prohibition of sorcery wouldn't be effective, and the mass imprisonment of sorcerers would not only reduce the kingdom's forces, but also further contributes to the spread of the curse. The company of knights he had sent away in a quest to find the Dark Soul would never return, and his decree only managed to further damage Venn's military, and the underground port would cease functioning, for its very operators had gone hollow. Despite Venn being at the height of its success as an empire, it was also at the height of its misery. After all, misery was what the empire stood for. Its fight against the curse was in vain, for they were ignorant of the means which could defeat it. The Mad King had reincarnated a chunk of the Old One's soul which rested within his homeland's soil. The soul, which had manifested itself as a parasite identical to the host of the Bed of Chaos, had been attracted to him for their similar nature. The king's fate self-fulfilled itself into that of the witch, who had built a parasitic empire in a twisted attempt of attaining a son. Before the marriage that earned Alken an ally, it was the weakest of all countries. Its domestic forces were exceptionally frail, for the nation had no access to any mineral deposits and thus couldn't forge equipment for its soldiers and knights. It held only Volgan as its territory, as the entirety of the southeast fell to ruin and was reclaimed by Mirrah, which was Venn's ally, as was Lanafir, which was claimed by Jugo. Volgan's coin reserves were the only glue holding the country together. In contrast to Alken, Venn had managed to unite both Mirrah and Forossa under its banner, meaning more than half of civilization was contemplated by its empire. As he pondered what he should do to avoid his empire's dissolution, the king would invite and entertain many guests who came from faraway lands, but a majority among them were opportunists and only wanted his coin. Recognizing Alken as the last bastion of firelinking within the New World, a noble soul from a distant eastern land would come to its king and swear loyalty to him. The Honorable Knight Alonne, whose name derives from iron, a reference to his strong adherence to his moral code, as well as from Aron, a name meaning of the mountains and enlightened, in reference to the Christian gnosis, for he stands for firelinking, as well as to the volcanoes. Alonne proves to be the miracle Alken needed. He trained the King's Knights in his foreign sword techniques, and later lead the weak forces of Alken to a resounding victory in Lanafir, and the territory would be reclaimed from Jugo. The center of Lanafir had been blasted with poison as consequence of a development of the underworld, and its forces had been weakened. That victory, combined with the alliance Forossa had sealed with Venn through marriage, would force Jugo to accept Alken as its ally, and their pact would be confirmed through a marriage between Mitha, the leader of the Desert Magi, and the king of Alken. The reconquest of Lanafir would also provide Alken with its abundant supply of Icaros ore, which they would use to vastly enhance their military power. Armor and weapons made from the dark iron and fashioned after Alonne, the king's now right-hand man, would be distributed among Alken's knights and soldiers. The warriors of Jugo would swear allegiance to Alken, and one of them would become known as the Mad Knight for his relentless, frenzied performance with his twin blade. The king would forge a ring based on his showings, the Ring of Blades, whose design is modeled after the Mad Knight's twin blade. It's interesting to note that the soldiers of the Iron King were equipped with copies of the Simpleton's Ring, a ring that references Velka. The divine protection it grants is invisibility when rolling. The meek are symbolically hidden by Velka's favor when threat comes their way. Velka is associated with occult knowledge, for she is a master manipulator. Thus, her followers are, ironically, the Simpletons, and with invisibility, and she is the caretaker of the meek. Miraculously, the southeast of the continent, which belongs to Venn's empire as those territories were controlled by Mirrah, would be invaded by migrants, who'd later form the country of Lindelt on the lands they had conquered. And even more providential was Lindelt's pledge to firelinking. The rising stars Alken and Lindelt became allies, an event which mirrors the alliance made by Mirrah and Venn in the past. The king orders the construction of a massive ore refinery plant near the volcanoes, the Brume Tower. This expansive construction project would plunge Alken into its heyday, an age of iron, which would make its ruler become known as the Iron King. Seeing opportunity in the rise of Alken, a magus named Eagle, his name meaning God's Cauldron, a scholar of pyromancy, would come to the king and pledge loyalty to him. His character is betrayed by the pyromancies he invented, those being Fire Snake and Dance of Fire, the latter of which behaves like a serpent that sadistically makes its targets dance with it. He was a man whose joy came from seeding chaos. Alken's ascension, its age of iron, came seemingly out of nowhere, but it would sink as quickly as it had peaked. The events which I will narrate now begin simultaneously with the crusades of the Heide Knights and the plot of the Warlocks, in the distant past before Havel and Olafis had become Alken and Venn. From the side of Olafis, the apostles of Lydia would ring the bells to disrupt the rest of the dead in order to raise an army of firelinkers. In response, the Lydia witches rebelled against firelinking, for they worshipped Galeb, the god of death, and their faith had intuitively developed into a desire to spread the plague, as Nito, the Allfather of the dead, the being Galeb is based on, had done in ancient times. For this reason, they'd gatekeep the crypts to prevent undead from entering, as well as to prevent the awakened from leaving. They wanted to halt firelinking by blocking the reincarnation of undead who'd journey to link the fire. As an aside, within the crypt are various statues of Galeb, that is, Nito, depicted as an elderly man, standing above statues of Kaita, that is, Velka, denoting their father-daughter dynamic. This conflict would be solved by the Finito, who would punish both sides for having disrupted the Crypt's natural cycle. The witches were turned into corporeal slaves, sentenced to forever protect the entrance to the Crypt from malicious invaders. Hence the apostles had their spirits enslaved, sentenced to forever safeguard the effigies, preventing disturbances to the slumbering man. From Havel's side, an order of holy knights from the southwest invaded the Crypt in an attempt to disrupt firelinking. In response, an order of knights from the southwest would organize themselves to gatekeep it from the invaders. The invading knights were high-ranking clerics, and conjured the Soul Appease miracle to dispose of Undead. This miracle conjures light to specifically damage those who don't possess it, the Hollows, the so-called agents of the dark. The defending knights wielded two extremely durable great shields made from the Dark Ichor's mineral. They blocked the corridors of the Crypt with their pairs of shields, which were as massive and strong as an iron gate. Their shields portray Orma, that is, Velka, who judges the guilty in the afterlife, and Reeve, that is, one of her Dark Moon Knights, who punishes them accordingly. This conflict too would be solved by the Finito, who'd punish both sides for having disrupted the Crypt's natural cycle. The invading knights were branded insolent, and their spirits were enslaved, sentenced to eternally punish those who cast light within the Crypt, like they had done. And the defending knights were branded Imperials, and sentenced to eternally gatekeep the Crypt from malicious invaders with their robust bodies. The dark appearance of the Imperials knights contrasts with that of the insolent knights, though the dark-looking shield-bearers were defending firelinking, which is, as previously alluded to, the path of the Christian, of the saint, of the archetypal Christ, and the so-called holy knights were fighting to spread death and curse. The Abyss is the closest ally of those who want to end the linking of the flame. It is the other side of the coin. Gwyn wished to prolong the reign of the sun over the sky, and Nito wished to prolong the reign of the Abyss over the underworld. Their interests aligned, and they cooperated for this reason, light and dark as one. As I have and will demonstrate time and time again, the Abyss only manifested itself as a force of corruption in response to Gwyn's actions, and its agents, the true agents of the dark, are the greatest opposers of firelinking, alongside the inheritors of Gwyn's will, which is why they collaborate, sometimes deliberately. The wars that raged on the Undead Crypt would wake the demon of song from its slumber. He'd learned to mimic the lullaby of the Milf Nito, which he'd employed to attract Undeads to his lair, so he could devour them. This would interrupt the activities of the Crypt, because the demon now stood as its gatekeeper. The following events begin simultaneously with the rise of Venn's empire and with its downfall. The survivors of the flood which ruined Havel southwest were now homeless, accursed undead who had been thrown down the gutter, forever confined to the filthy underworld. From their midst, two courageous undead would rise against the curse and journey through the lands with the goal of attaining a gleaming soul to link the fire with. One was named Pharros, and he'd leave many contraptions to aid those in need, especially other journeying undead like him. He'd build dozens of secret chambers, where he'd store the treasures his traveling partner would loot. The name of the partner was Flynn, which means descendant of Flan, Flan meaning blood red, crimson. Flan, as previously explained, is Gwyn's firstborn, the god of flame, whose name was corrupted in the New World as Faram, and later lost completely. The chambers would be locked with a mechanism known as a Door of Pharros, a giant stone lock, its visual representing a hollow's face, that would only open through the insertion of a lockstone. One of his most notable inventions was the poison-spitting mechanism he'd add to the effigies of Velka, which were so abundant in the gutter. He turns them into tools for the denizens' protection, which goes together with Velka's will of caring for the downtrodden. And the statues spit poison, which is the blood of undead, their sacrifices being employed to help their brethren, like the bonfire, which was Velka's invention, is fueled by the bones of martyred undead. Both Pharros and Flynn would be idolized by legend for their achievements, one as a courageous explorer helpful to those in sincere and dire need, and the other as a Robin Hood-type figure, a thief who'd steal to give back to the meek. They'd clear the four corners of the continent. There is a Door of Pharros even in the frigid outskirts, the northern limit where the undead of Elionlois were sent in exile. Among their noblest accomplishments was their help toward the rats. Pharros would stumble upon the Rat King, and after learning of the oath man had broken, he'd be convinced to help the rats safeguard their lair, an honorable gesture to mend the mistakes of men. In partnership with Pharros, the Rat King would create a new covenant with the humans he deemed worthy and who wished to serve him, honoring man's ancient accord. Should a man bash his strongest warriors, a rat-eating dog who had his farm twisted by his diet, or his vanguard of rat soldiers, the king would acknowledge his valor. The royal rat authority serves as a parallel to Sith. Both are dogs who serve their masters by enacting trials of strength to the journeying undead. He would also forge the poison-enhancing ring which the Rat King would give to his new subjects, himself being the first among them. As Pharros travels through the Rat King's territory, building many traps along the way, he'd stumble upon the Gurm, his neighbors. The Gurm, a people named after germs, for their uncleanliness, used to be the workers who excavated the sewers and underground watercourses of Heide. They were the ones who provided water for the desert lands of Allfather, who sent clean water in the way to their fountains. However, they'd never be allowed to return to the surface, for the filth they endured in their line of work had affected their physiognomy, turning them into sturdy, but small-sized, simple-minded demi-humans, like the pygmies, the primitive ancestors of man. As a result of their honesty and hard work, they were unfairly sentenced to permanent exile by the very men who had hired them. In their exile, they'd build and build without an objective in mind, for that is all they knew how to do. They ended up producing one of the most beautiful places in the world, though one marked by the tragedy of its builders. Pharros would build many traps to protect their territory from invaders, and teach the Gurm how to operate them, as well as hideouts to both hide them and their goods, many of which were gifts from Flynn. He's the man responsible for the booby traps within the chest of the New World. During his travels, Pharros would learn the secret of a forbidden relationship and be moved by the passion of the two lovers. He'd protect their meeting places with his contraptions, hiding their entrances. After having traveled through the four corners of the continent, the pair would be mesmerized by what they perceived to be the promised land their people needed. Below the deepest stretch of the gutter, known as the Black Gulch, for the dark liquid which flowed through it, a tar-like, flammable, abyssal substance, they'd be met with a wondrous sight, an underground haven. Waterfalls of immaculate water rained through the walls of the cave, and its roof was abundant with roots of arch trees, which the pair would quickly find to be highly nutritious. Dried roots restore HP for an extended duration. Even more impressive was the cause for such an immaculate environment to exist just beyond the foulest places. A dragon, which had been absorbing the impurities of the underworld and containing them within itself, like a nature-made saint, was slumbering at its core. The two friends were convinced this was the place they wanted for their people. They'd house their fire-linking ambition and return to the gutter, and lead the now indigent masses of undead in an exodus to the perennial, subterranean paradise. Upon completing their migration, they founded Shulva, the Sanctum City, a name derived from the Hebrew word Shalva, meaning peace and serenity, which serves to further reference the exodus of the Jews of the Old Testament. Pharros was elected as their king for his merits, and for the immense soul he had amassed during his expansive journey. Shulva would develop a faith that based itself on retellings of the older tales of the gods, through the miracle scrolls its people had managed to salvage from the ruins of their flooded country, and the worship of the slumbering dragon, who they fittingly saw as their savior. They'd build a holy wall, an intricately crafted mural that depicted their kingdom's story, with Sin as its center, to shelter the dragon, and the priestesses would sing a lullaby to preserve its deep slumber. The inhabitants of Shulva would create an abundant supply of medicine and supplements through the roots which blessed their land. The dried roots and the balms, as well as through the nigh-immortal essence of the slumbering dragon, the dragon charms, which can both heal and cure poison. Pharros would fill the city with his contraptions as a means of safeguarding it from invaders. He'd also create new ones, such as the iconic magnetic towers which can double as hiding spots and watchtowers for its sentinels. Pharros would also reverse engineer the Avelin, a treasure of the old world, and build the repeating crossbows, which he'd give to his troops. Those that were close to hollowing were taken to the Cave of the Dead, where statues of Velka, which Pharros has turned into tools for the safety of his people, like the poison-spitting effigies, would petrify their bodies, preventing the curse from spreading. An idea Pharros got from his exploration of the Grave of Saints, where the rats would bite and petrify the corpses of the dead to prevent them from rising from their graves. Hidden within the grotto rested the reincarnated soul of an old one, the great soul of the father of the dead, Nito. The power of that soul was behind the formation of the magnetic ores exclusive to the cave, which, in reference to Nito's necromantic powers, allowed a special, segmented weapon forged from it by Pharros to separate and rebuild itself. The ore also powers the contraptions that move the various pillars of Shulva. Elana, a reincarnation of the great soul of Manus, the father of the Abyss, of his wrath, whose name, which derives from Helena, ironically means light or shining, would be intuitively attracted to the powerful soul of Shulva's sovereign. She'd suddenly appear before him, and just as suddenly make him enamored with her, for the dark is a powerful temptation. Elana, who presented herself as a priest, though she was a priest of darkness, would come to the king with a Faustian bargain. She'd tell him of a way to attain eternal life. Elana would extensively subvert their culture, which stood for the safety and protection of the distressed. She would teach the priests of Shulva the dark arts. Through them, they'd produce an army of untouchable spirit warriors, their seals having been linked to an effigy through a bloodletting ritual. The priestesses of Shulva would be subverted into becoming witches, and its soldiers had a hex cast on their crossbows, enabling them to shoot dark orbs. Of course, Elena's aim was to suppress the Abyss. She plans to create an army to conquer the worlds to establish an empire of darkness. Shulva would also produce red-eye orbs through dark rituals that involved human sacrifice, which they'd use to invade and kill men to suppress death and prevent firelinking. The people of Shulva would extract the souls of the living for themselves, transcending life through the same means the Dark Wraiths had employed before them. Shulva's ziggurat is a reference to the pyramids of the Mesoamerican peoples who conducted rituals of human sacrifice and ate the hearts of the sacrificed to absorb their vigor. Adorning the exterior of Shulva's buildings are depictions of its people as Mesoamerican pagans. Such murals stand in sharp contrast to those found in the interiors of the same buildings, which depicts them as one would expect, in line with the design of their holy wall. The newly engraved external murals are indicative of a development not merely of their artistic sensibilities, but of their culture. The Sanctum City underwent a descent into violent paganism. Elena's design looks like a rotting tree, trees being symbols of prosperity and life, which, when rotted, become symbols of corruption and death. The design of her axe is based on the unrefined catalyst wielded by Manus, which, like the axe, scales with strength. She can summon mud impressions of beings she fought against in the past, including those of fallen warriors, those which invaded Shulva, and Velstad, who she'd later face during Vendrick's travel to the Sunken City. Interestingly, she can also summon wild pigs, which she came across in Majula upon arriving in the New World by way of the sea. Pharros' journey mirrors that of the chosen undead, with Flynn being a cooperator, and his intention was to link the fire after Shulva's founding, to become the first true king of the New World. But the materialistic paradise he had built, alongside Elena's bargain, had convinced him to betray his noble ambition and rule as a Dark Lord with power over death. And so, an archetypal Christ turned into an archetypal Antichrist, an arc which mirrors Gwyn's, who at first fought for the emancipation of mankind, but later betrayed it. A new wave of migrants invaded the southeastern shores of the continent. The immigrants consisted mostly of displaced knights of Baldur and Katarina, their leader being Jorg, whose name derives from York, meaning wild boar, a reference to his strength, courage, and relentlessness, as well as to the boars that inhabited his old homeland in Lordran. Jorg commanded his own company of knights, the Drakeblood Knights. They had migrated from Lordran to Heide, to see for themselves if the rumors about the existence of an ancient dragon in the continent were true. If they were to find that dragon, they'd slay it and drink its sacrosanct blood to attain true immortality. Jorg's forces quickly took over the Cardinal Tower, and later the Tower of Flame, confining Mirrah to the Sunless Realms, that is, the Huntsman Copse. They'd loot the lands they conquered, and the Drakeblood Knights would equip the Spirit Tree shields they got from pillaging the Church of Blue. Then, Jorg would lead a small army of knights toward the holy city of Shulva, which in accordance with the stories they had heard, was where the slumbering dragon rested. His knights invaded the Underworld Kingdom, and Shuva's labyrinthic configuration along with its traps and contraptions proved insufficient, and its military faltered, allowing the Drakeblood Knights to loot their way through the city and reach their holy wall that guarded the ancient dragon. Upon reaching the wall, York would be faced with Pharros, the king himself. They would fight to the death, and Pharros would fall, and the victor would claim his crown. York would penetrate the wall and find his ultimate prize behind it. Wishing to bathe himself in sacrosanct blood, he'd stab the dragon's chest with his spear, and the blood he desired, spilled as a miasma of death and disease, for the dragon contains the toxins that emanated from Nito's soul, that in a matter of moments ravaged Shuva. York wouldn't survive the incident, and the crown which he had claimed was eaten alongside him by Sin, the dragon whose name references the great sin that was inflicted upon it, and the kingdom he supported. The slumbering dragon, which, when asleep, acted as Christ, would become like the beast of Revelation upon its wake, a metaphor for the positive and negative uses for the raw energy of nature. In Shuva, the Drakeblood Knights were met with a mirror, which reflected their hedonistic ways. After their campaign against the Sanctum City, which served as the symbolic death of their hero's journey, they were able to advance to the next step toward Gnosis. The dead body of Pharros was taken to the Cave of the Dead by Alana, but instead of being petrified and allowed to rest for eternity, it was made to reincarnate the soul of an old one which rested within the grotto. The great soul of the first of the dead, Nito. The soul's influence first manifested itself as a nurturing force, in reference to Nito's nurturing character for his family of dead. But as Shuva was subverted, the effects of Nito's soul would be as well, and it now manifested itself as a wrathful, death-spreading curse, which would possess the king of the then sacred city. From a combination of the corpses of the dead with the abyssal tar of the Black Gulch and the old one's reincarnated soul, Alana built a monstrosity, the being who would be called the Rotten. The Rotten would crawl back to the Black Gulch to protect the entrance of Shuva from invaders, while Alana would work to rebuild her army from the dead, still with the aim of conquering the world and establishing an abyssal empire. As previously inferred, Alana was like a Satan who Pharros made a deal with. So, even after the death of his body, his soul would be made an eternal slave by her. The Rotten is like a mass of sinners who were sentenced to suffer in hell, surrounded by omens of the goddess of sin who judged them, by effigies of Velka, the founder of firelinking, a duty which they betrayed. Despite having been reduced to a mere slave butcher made of dark and dead flesh, the Rotten still bore the essence of the old ruler of Shuva within. Regardless of its faded consciousness, the monster continuously struggles to fix the broken Velka statues scattered through his lair, in a vain effort of wielding the forces of creation he had mastered in the past, when he came so close to attaining the final Gnosis. Upon defeating him, the bearer of the curse finally grants peace to a man who fell prey to evil, but yearned for and warranted redemption. The mask of Pharros is strikingly similar to the mask of the Father from Dark Souls 1. Strangely, tears continually flow from its eyes, soaking its owner in them, for Pharros was like an Allfather to the Undead, and mourned for their suffering. His character arc mirrors Nito's, for he was, at first, a nurturing caretaker of the dead, but ended up becoming a plague spreader, whose ambition to rule over the world required him to become an agent of death itself, an agent of the abyss. The sacredness of the city and Pharros' kingship over it are also connected to Nito's role as Allfather Lloyd, the main deity of the ancient way of white religion, who ruled over his underworld empire. Near the bonfire at the entrance of the Black Gulch are 3 holes, which form the face of a hollow. As an aside, each old one's soul that reincarnated in the new world would act as a Faustian bargain. They'd first be employed as tools for the prosperity of nations, embodying the positive aspects of the former lords. But as the nations themselves were corrupted, so would the souls that rested below them, and one would influence the other in a loop of energetic exchanges. Shuva would, after its downfall, be a subject of fascination among explorers and thieves. 3 of them would manage to reach the Cave of the Dead in search of the great soul of an old one, which according to rumor was hidden there, but found nothing, as the bulk of the soul had been claimed by Alana to create the Rotten, and remains there forever in a fitting punishment for their greed. It's likely that they heard that Shuva was a kingdom that had uncovered the secrets to eternal life, a half-truth that put an end to their adventures. Curiously, the warrior wearing Havel's armor set is the only one who can drink Estus flasks, a reference to old man McLoyf, Havel's deific identity. Havel was the man who created the Estus Flask. With their leader dead, the surviving Drakeblood Knights fled the calamity and resurfaced from the depths. As they arrived at the Tower of Flame, they'd make a pact among them. They'd bury their story alongside the kingdom that had sunken into ruin and fund a country, which they'd call Lindelt, a name composed by the word Lane, which means to recite religious texts, and Del, which means valley among trees. As a curiosity, Leyndell, from Elden Ring, shares this etymology. Lindelt and Leyndell are essentially the same name. Lindelt would be a theocracy, which the Drakeblood Knights, who'd become its clergy, the most powerful social class of the country, their religious texts having been looted from the sunken city, would rule with strict authority. They established their headquarters at Havel's ancient castle in the northwest, which hid the Dragon Shrine, as they had also heard rumors of a dragon egg hidden within it. At the shrine, they'd build a replica of the Holy Wall of Shulva, where the petrified egg of the dragons was stored, a direct reference to the configuration of Shulva's mural in relation to the slumbering dragon. They hoped to hatch the egg, so they could amend their shameful sin by caring for the being who'd truly be the last of its kind, should it wish to be born. They'd also wish to mend their sin by aiding firelinking, the journey of the supreme martyrs who'd atone for the sins of their fellow men, with the aim of restoring nature's cycles and empowering both men and the dragons. Lindelt would recreate the rings of sacrifice, which Velka had pioneered in Lordran. They would be spread through the continent, and aid many future travelers who wished to link the fire. They'd explore the fallen Tseldora, and there, aspiring scholars would study sorcery in secret. At first, that is, for the art was prohibited by the country's strict laws. However, as Lindelt realized the usefulness of sorcery, seeing it as a means of solving the undead curse, the highest-ranking members of their clergy, the very men who had founded the country and were the keepers of its history, hypocritically wished to master it. Those men would form the Archdrake sect, a sect that venerated Sif, the Pale Drake, which would justify its integration into Lindelt's society of dragon worshippers. The Brightstone of Tseldora would be mined for its use on the tip of the staves, which would be wielded by the Archdrake sect, and later by the staves which would be wielded by the Amana priestesses. And to adorn their armors, whose design references Sif, their helmets bearing a sculpture of him realized as a fuller being, and their shields depicting a serpent which has acquired wings. Lindelt would often send members of the sect, many of whom wanted to escape their homeland's authoritarian rule, in pilgrimage to the Undead Crypt. Holy women who studied sorcery would also be sent on pilgrimage to the Crypt. They'd become known as Amana priestesses, and would protect the shrine from malicious invaders, conjuring spells of the long-lost Olafis, which they studied. Their dresses refer to Lydia's design, the ancient queen of Olafis. The blue-dripping cloth attached to their hoods represents tears of mourning for the dead, as well as the light, the golden text, traveling downward. The horns they wear on their heads, which are simply wise tree branches, are both a reference to the deer, which Lydia's clan had as a symbol, that represents resurrection, and the chains and DNA strands depicted on their loincloths and capes, alongside the dragon's head, are symbols of their covenants of firelinking. The pilgrims would attempt to appease the demon of song with sacrifice. They blamed the Nito for the demon's behavior, thinking they had purposely taught it to sing, and so they'd capture them and feed them to the monster instead of allowing it to feed on the undead of the crypt. This would allow the crypt to continue its activities undisturbed by the monster. The events which I will narrate now happened simultaneously to York's invasion of the New World. The Mad King of Venn had become increasingly distressed, for not only had each and every attempt at improving his kingdom been a vain effort, but he had also now begun to lose a huge chunk of his territory in an invasion by foreign warriors he didn't foresee coming, and he heard the news of Jugo's alliance with Alken, and of Alken's rising military. It was under these circumstances that he grew suspicious of his queen, entertaining the idea that she had been trading secrets with Venn's enemies. Their relation had been cold and distant since its beginning, and the queen would often hide away as the belfry, prohibiting anyone from entering it. When he heard of the Lindelt-Alken alliance, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. Thus, he had plans to invade the belfry the next time she went there. The king and his royal guard would slaughter the bellkeeper puppets, leaving behind piles of bodies. They climbed the tower and found the queen meeting with the spirit of the king of Alken atop it. In a fit of madness and uncontrollable rage, the king of Venn stabbed his queen in front of both his subordinates and her secret lover. Instants after the frenzy, the killer deeply regretted his actions, and was finally able to perceive his own insanity. He'd sentence himself to perpetual imprisonment at the Bastille's most secluded cell, and leave his kingdom devoid of a king and a queen. The castle he ruled over would become known as the Lost Bastille, and the king as the Lost Sinner. As a prisoner, he wore a black mask made from Bastille, the special alloy of Forossa, whose secret formula he had shared with his allied nations. The mask was molded to portray the king's descent into darkness, and it bore spikes pointed toward its owner's face, which would serve to blind and torture him, a self-inflicted, symbolic punishment for his lack of foresight, which he perceives to have been the source of his empire's downfall, the Bastille being emblematic of his hollowing, for the alloy lacks souls within its constitution, which is what grants it its unique properties. His sword, which was forged from Bastille, would have its essence twisted by his guilt, for it would drain its wielder's health with each swing, and have its strength penalized by its wielder's sins. Even hollowed and cuffed, however, his origin as a warrior king of Forossa is betrayed by his nimble movements and swordplay. The penalized king, who was once the bravest of lion knights, who strived so fiercely for the sun, now could not bear to see the faintest light. The darkness of his cell was a symbol of his foolishness, though the bearer of the curse can circumvent it by lighting 2 fires to brighten it. During his self-imprisonment, the king reflected upon his numerous mistakes, and finally came to a maddening conclusion. All of his efforts to undo man's curse were in vain. They went directly against his best interests, for they spread and intensified the curse. He desperately wished to repent by linking the flame, having finally understood his fatal flaw. In a frenzy, he killed his 2 pyromancer guards, and tried burning himself with their remains, but it was too late. He was but a hollow, a shadow of his former self. Even this desperate final stand against darkness was in vain. It was but a pitiful ritual, and he only managed to burn his body as a result. Interestingly, the Japanese text never specifies the gender of the Lost Sinner, for the title refers to both the Mad King and to the Witch of Chaos who possessed him, one of the many clever details of the game's writing. In comparison, the English text refers to the Lost Sinner as a she, for it is referring to the witch. The spirits of the bellkeepers would eternally haunt the belfries, despite their abandonment. They would follow their duty even after death, and the spirits of the 2 pyromancer guards would remain protecting their king's cell for eternity. As a result of witnessing the tragic death of his lover before his eyes, the King of Alken would be left profoundly scarred. The wound in his heart would never heal, only grow deeper and deeper. Despite now having nearly the entire continent under his banner, as his empire finally reached its heyday, his achievements weren't enough to satisfy him. He would fall into depravity and hedonism, abandoning his ambition to become a true king. He wouldn't aim to link the fire, but to create an immortal, earthly paradise, or rather, an Icarus hell, which he would rule as a mighty emperor. The crest his empire had inherited from the king and queen of Heide, the 2 dragons and the sword piercing the flower, became devoid of its meaning. The vulgar materialism of the Iron King was epitomized by his newfound hobby of collecting weapons to keep as prizes and decoration. The king descended from an ancient culture of honorable warriors that traced its roots from before the Age of Fire, a culture that respected bravery and valor above all. But the king had subverted it by treating weapons as toys, and reveling in acts of dishonor and cruelty. Even the weapons of the supremely loyal and honorable Black Knights of Lordran, who served his predecessor, Gwyn, were now just eccentric trinkets which the Iron King would store away in chests. His collection even included a counterfeit, but he was too foolish to recognize. He'd also managed to acquire a set of armor of a Darkrave. One of the methods he employs to expand his collection was to send mercenaries to invade other worlds and steal them from travelers, like Fencer Sharon, Oliver the Collector, and Armorer Dennis. Gordon, the Wandering Knight of Forossa, was killed for this reason during a visit to Brume Tower, and the Iron King claims the Great Sword of Artorias for himself. Greed was a symptom many men of Volgen, the land of wealth and commerce, would develop, and now, even the once diligent king had become one of them. The king would extensively reform his castle, turning it into an abomination of iron. He'd ordered the construction of iron statues that depicted his newfound ambition, a flower that hosted a flame, which is symbolic of the sun, that is erected by a group of men, in reference to how the undead must carry the burden of erecting the sun, by having their souls emptied by the dark sign. There are also various cherub-like statues holding fires atop their heads throughout the keep. The statue of Velka, which was situated at the center of the bridge to his castle, was symbolically chained, and the chains that were attached to it host cages. And as I've explained, such cages serve to imprison men to extract their souls to fuel the sun. He'd also capture and enslave the flame salamanders to serve his castle's defenses. The satanic cruelty of the Iron King was betrayed by the new faith he would spread to his people, the worship of Nar Alma, the god of blood. Nar Alma was a horrific false idol, whose character goes completely against what the figure it was deliberately made to subvert stood for. That being Velka, the mother of the forlorn, who shed tears to mourn the undead, and who became a martyr for the sake of the many, of the meek. She was the goddess who served as a pillar to Alken since its foundation, and who watched over the entrance to the king's castle, the goddess of fire-linking. Nar Alma, a deity who desires only bloodshed, who judges his followers based on the number of men they kill, as indicated by the Libra it holds, its meaning being the inversion of Velka's Libra, which signifies divine justice upon sinners, and who is depicted with a stoic expression on his face, was the absolute inversion of Kaita, the goddess of tears, who is Velka's interpretation by the civilizations of the New World. Velka's scythe symbolizes the power the meek hold over the powerful, for scythes are weapons that derive from farming tools of peasants. And so, should the rulers abuse their power, they'd face justice manifested as death, which is universal. The scythe too had its meaning subverted, and Nar Alma wielded it as a symbol of senseless death and violence. Even his gender is inverted. Velka was a female, and Nar Alma is a male god. Velka was the goddess of sin, for she punished the guilty. Nar Alma, the god of the sinners, for he emboldened the guilty. Kremel is a false deity worshipped alongside Nar Alma. The god of struggle is based on Kirk, the Knight of Thorns, who dedicated himself to serving a saint. He'd invade out of necessity, to pillage humanity which he'd give to his sickly savior, so that she could survive, a sinner with pure intentions, a martyr. Kremel, however, is a deity worshipped by senseless sinners, who view him as a god that encourages the proliferation of suffering. The Ring of Thorns is an aggressive tool, one that does not protect its owner, but damages his aggressor, used by the warriors of Jugo, who rush mindlessly into combat. Tichigren, the original Bellkeeper, would be appointed as the leader of Nar Alma's covenant by the Iron King. Its adherents, most of them hailing from Jugo, would be instructed to hunt undead mercilessly. In accordance with their cowardly but aggressive ways, they'd wield shield crossbows to inflict agony upon others with impunity, as well as whips and other weapons that doubled as instruments of torture. The puppet created to protect the forbidden love was turned into a satanic pastor of a death cult as that love was killed. The blood cultists, led by 3 warrior pyromancers of Jugo, whose armor resembles that of Aurous, would invade the sunless realm of Mirrah, its last remaining territory, and decimate its people. The hunters had become the hunted. The warriors of Mirrah, who hunted undead, were now the undead being hunted by Jugo's crusade, a symbolic, ironic punishment for their twisted ways. The spring which was the source of the holy water of Mirrah would be tainted by piles and piles of bodies as a result of that war. However, the men of the land would rise again, for they were undead, and so, the hunts would be prolonged unto eternity, and eventually, the hunters themselves, who were covered in wounds, scars, and some of whom became cannibals and bloated like pigs in a subtle reference to Smough, who served Gwyn, like they served the Iron King, would hollow. The moonlit butterflies that inhabited the realm would become poisonous, for the tree sap they fed upon had been contaminated by the blood of undead, which is toxic. After the Iron King's men had conquered the land, they'd build a colosseum to torture undead to the point where their souls faded into nothing, yet another subversion of the ancient culture of Gwyn's clan of warriors. A skeletal, miasma-spewing, spike-bearing chariot would continually gallop through the arena to trample over and cut through the waves of undead. Necromancers would then continually revive those that had been killed, so they'd be killed more, and each time, their souls would wane a little more. And in a tie to the idea of souls exchanging energy with each other, resulting in a cycle of corruption which ends in possession and depravity, the executioner who rode the chariot would be possessed by the chariot itself, or perhaps it was the other way around. The chariots were similar in nature to the ogre-like humanoids of Earth and Peak. They were the fruits of dark rituals involving the mixture of remains of undead creatures to create Frankenstein's monster-like abominations. The ogre-like humanoids were designed to threaten, torture, and if necessary, kill the slave workers of the mines, and the chariots to torture the captured victims of the undead hunts. As an aside, the horse was the animal of Jugo. It dashes relentlessly and tramples over its foes. This can be observed in Benhart of Jugo's helmet, which is ornamented with a horse. His chest, however, bears the heraldic symbol of Mirrah, the deer, because his clan defected from Jugo. The men of Jugo are simple-minded but strong, in contrast to its women, who are cunning sorceresses. His clan was offered an ancient treasure in trade for their loyalty, and they gladly accepted the offer without realizing the sham. The sword was a fake. The Moonlight Greatsword scales with intelligence, and Benhar's fake sword is a raw imitation. But he and his clan were too simple-minded to notice, as are the men of Jugo. Eagle, the suspicious pyromancer, proposed to the Iron King he should not only use his broom tower to produce copious amounts of iron, but also to create new beings from its Icarus liquid, the lava that derives from Gwyn's soul. Along with the supply of the Icarus mineral, the old and rusty golems of Heide were melted and recycled into matter to create new golems. Among them rose the Iron Warriors, automatons that subtly mirrored Idolith's giants, whose heads were ornate iron sculptures of the crest of the king's clan, a bull. They wielded massive weapons and leaked lava from their otherwise empty frames onto their enemies. The ironclad soldiers would also come from this array of robots. In response to the king's approval of his ideas, which were based on his ambition to be like the Witch of Izalith, a creator of an army of demons who'd subjugate the world, Eagle would task the metal workers with sculpting an iron statue of a minotaur as a gift to his lord. That statue, which would be known as Eagle's Idol, is a reference to Moloch, the Canaanite god who demanded human sacrifice in trade for material benefits, whose worshippers built metallic statues of, which doubled as furnaces that burned the sacrifice. The bull represented masculinity, strength, and abundance. It was a fitting symbol to represent the clan that idealized strong warriors and that possessed a large fortune. The ancient depiction of a lion slaying a bull represents the start of the harvest season. However, it too had been subverted into an idol of human sacrifice and futile materialism. The bull wasn't slain but idolized, like Moloch. It stood for stagnation, for eternal life in the material world, which would be sustained by the sacrifices of the meek. The Iron King would hire a band of foreign mercenaries who he had invited to his kingdom, a lot known as the Mad Warriors, as they fought like berserkers on the battlefield. They were hollowing undead whose sanity was depleted, and who wanted to fill their emptiness with killing, and by playing with their prey, they were predators of men, like the predator which their designs reference. Their presence in Alken was emblematic of the Iron King's increasingly twisted, unhinged ways. In response to the king's moral downfall, his right-hand man, Sir Alonne, would break his vow and leave the kingdom feeling utterly disappointed with the man he had once looked up to, who he thought would become a true king, leaving only his armor behind. Or perhaps he did not, but lied within his chamber, its floor immaculately polished, a symbol of his immaculate soul, for as is above, so is below, loyally sitting in secluded wait for a worthy warrior to break into the castle and challenge him so that he might, at last, be honorably discharged from the oath sworn to his king. Or perhaps he did both of those things. Or, somberly, it may have been the king himself who came to challenge his own right-hand man. The memory in which Sir Alonne rests is titled The King's Memory, implying the Iron King went to his chamber to confront him for his refusal to serve him. Alonne parallels Aaron, the biblical character he shares a name with, the Iron King, Moses, Aaron's brother. However, instead of punishing heretics for their worship of a false idol, a golden bull which stood for hedonism, he embraced it, becoming like a Moloch himself. The knights who served under Alonne would defect upon learning of his disappearance. The king would animate their armors as automatons, and task them with guarding the keep for eternity. His loyal, honored men were leaving his command, and he has to replace them with empty husks, a symbol of the decadence of both him and his empire. The Iron King's most ambitious project was the creation of an iron dragon, yet another emblematic display of his twisted character, for it represents an unholy mockery of nature. After all, the dragon is the prima materia, nature incarnate. This project also mirrors Gwyn's ambition to attain the metaphorical Philosopher's Stone. Ygg would first create a magic field automaton, which would never leave the Brume Tower. This magic field's Melter Demon was created to emulate the dragons, which were alchemically aligned with, originally, water. However, upon creating its fire-fueled counterpart, the Red Melter Demon, he transported it to the Iron Keep and presented it to his king. The king was enamored by it, so much so that he would be blinded by his fascination, and with a single strike, the dragon kills the king and destroyed his kingdom. In truth, Alken had been sinking into lava, an allegory for the Iron King's hedonism, for his pride, ever since the castle was reformed into the Iron Keep. And the smiting of the Melter Demon, who represents the indomitable, raw energy of nature, which is Satan himself, thus the demonic-looking design, was simply the tipping point. He who had approached the profound mysteries of the soul had used his power over life to bring his own ruin. As the king sunk into the Icarus earth, he was possessed by the great soul of the Old One, which rested within it. By the soul of the Lord of Light, Gwyn. Gwyn's soul had been influencing the king's actions, or perhaps the king's actions that had made the soul become attracted to him. When they came into direct contact with each other, the Iron King was reborn as the incarnation of Lucifer, the fallen angel, the Lightbringer, of Satan, a monstrous being made from molten iron and stone, whose veins are filled with Icarus liquid, like the Greek gods. His strong frame was maintained, and on his head grew two enormous horns, which subtly referenced the bull, besides serving as emblems of the demonic. His dark armor would become possessed by a piece of his spirit, and would forever haunt the lands as a ghostly knight, who would be known as Pursuer, a reference to the name of the king's homeland, Volgen, which means to pursue. Though, in Japanese, the being's name is Cursebound, which has a double meaning of relating to the Iron King's human nature, as well as to the curse that binds his spirits to the armor. The armor would hunt journeying undead, interrupting their fire-linking journeys, and claim their weapons, which it couldn't even wield, just out of the materialistic habit which the Iron King has developed. The unappeased souls of the men it killed would attach themselves to the black armor of the ghost, sentenced to forever be a part of it. The sword wielded by the Pursuer was a favorite weapon of the Iron King. It shoots out a beam of faint moonlight, like the sword that was legend in Jugo, the Moonlight Greatsword. Like Benhart, the king was but a fool who could not see the weapon as a cheap counterfeit. And like Benhart, who betrayed his country for a weapon, which he valued for its perceived status alone, the king betrayed his country and ambition for vulgar materialism, which his gear collection is emblematic of. The original Moonlight Greatsword had a scaling with intelligence. Its counterfeits do not, and those who wield them are but simpletons. The Pursuer also rides a giant eagle into battle, which inversely mirrors Velka's giant crow. The eagle is a symbol of the sun, and Gwyn was represented by it in the New World. Fittingly, the eagle aids the Pursuer in his undead hunts, obstructing fire-linking, spreading the curse, and calling upon the dawn, while the crow aided the chosen undead in his journey to link the fire, undoing the curse and calling upon the night. The dichotomy between Venn and Alken inversely mirrored as the beginning of their existence, that of Karim and Torland. For Venn, the country of dexterous swordsmen and sorcerers, led by a wise woman, proliferated the curse, and Alken, the country of strong warrior priests, led by a strong man, wished to link the fire. The events which I will narrate now begin right before the start of the Iron King's downfall, and serve to complement his narrative. Mitha, the queen of Jugo, would fall deeply in love with her arranged bride from the moment they met, for she was fascinated by the strength of his gleaming soul. For the desert magi are parasitic and attracted to power, like the sisters of the abyss themselves, but her feelings would not be reciprocated. In a display of her character, she'd become obsessed with her appearance, thinking that if she became even more beautiful than she already was, she'd steal her king's heart. A golden opportunity appeared before her. Lanafir, which was situated right above Shulva, where the slumbering dragon had been wounded by Yorg, would be filled with a poisonous miasma. She had heard stories about the immortality of the ancient dragons, and so she thought that by treating herself with the poison that originated from sin, she'd attain the beauty she coveted, a never-fading youthfulness, superior even to that which the life drain of the desert magi could provide. However, no matter how beautiful she became, the king remained distant, never impressed with her efforts, for his heart belonged to his secret lover, a woman he loved for her purity of soul, something Mirrah would never attain. Because Lindelt had sent many of its pilgrims to deal with the demon of song, the Undead Crypt had lent a squad of Grave Wardens to Alken. They were stationed in Mirrah's domain, and would serve as her guards. The Undead of Jugo who fell to the curse were transported to the valley and made to work as slaves. The overseers of the mining operation of the Harvest Valley were cowardly men, who sat on the shoulders of aberrations born of dark, man-made rituals to avoid contact with the miasma. Mirrah would become increasingly unhinged, mistreating her subjects more and more, going so far as to cutting the hands of those who didn't work hard enough in the mines and replacing them with hooks as punishment. She'd breathe life into slave puppets, the mannequins, with the miasma, and employ them as assassins, tasking them with slaying those who intruded upon her domain as to avoid interrupting her cosmetic procedures. She would become so mad as to replace the water that flows to her bathing chamber with liquid poison, which she would submerge herself in to achieve transcendental beauty, a reference to the fabled Fountain of Youth. This would turn her into a gorgon. Scales began to grow on her now greenish skin, and her legs fused into a serpent's tail. Disgusted with her ugly, monstrous body, she would decapitate anyone who dares to look at her, even her puppets, which couldn't see, for they had no eyes. Luckily for her, her personal guards, the Grave Wardens, conveniently had a veil over their faces. However, her face was, indeed, more beautiful than ever as a result of that last resort, and having realized that, the Mad Queen would decapitate herself and present her head to her king. Hence the king would never see her again, abhorred by her madness. Mirrah was the fairest woman of all from the start. What she lacked was not looks, but character. Her name, which could also be translated as Mida, is a reference to Midas, the hedonistic emperor, and baneful is a clever translation of her epitaph, since it has the archaic meaning of poisonous. Mirrah cast sorcery, for her nature as a pyromancer was inversed by the essence of the dragon, which is water and dark. The configuration of the earthen peak is a layered allegory. The castle is a reference to the Tower of Babel, with Mirrah being the man who wishes to become like God. She is the demiurge, the dragon, the immortal serpent that feeds itself through the enslavement of man. The windmills, which sustain Mirrah's eternal youth, stand for the samsara, the cycle of reincarnation that extracts man's souls to feast the demiurge, which is why the bearer of the curse must burn the central windmill to stop the poison from flowing into Mirrah's room, to strip her of her fountain of youth. In the lower realm are the archons, the servants of the demiurge, demons who are microcosmic demiurges themselves, the desert sorceresses. And in an even lower realm are the lower demons, the slave masters. Working under them are enslaved undead, whose souls are set to fade into nothingness, and hollowing is a phenomenon opposite to that of attaining gnosis. In contrast to the king that had constantly rejected her, Aurous, her former lover, the founder of Jugo, and its king, was always trying to reclaim her affection, something he never truly possessed, for he was merely her pawn. In an attempt to become strong like the man Mirrah loved, he'd gouge on his fellow man, compensating for his lacking soul with cannibalism. He'd bloat like a pig, and nearly soften into sludge, transforming into a deformed, grotesque, serpent-looking demon which knew only to eat and desire. It's a tendency of the men of Jugo to conceptually and sometimes physically resemble Smaug, Gwyn's most loyal servant, the cannibal executioner, for they are meek, but covetous. This segment takes place after Vayne fell to ruin. After Forossa's downfall, the warriors who resided on its mainland would become bandits and thieves and scatter to various lands. The Order of the Lion Knights, who had been now reduced to a clan of barbarians, would gradually hollow and have their forms twisted by the egregory which they cultivated, that is, of the lion-like god of war. They'd become grotesque chimeras, half man, half lion, a phenomenon that references the birth of the demons of chaos. Some of them would be petrified by the demiurgic soul of the Old One, of the Witch of Chaos, and in response, the rest of them would develop the superstitious belief that the basilisks, greedy, serpent-like creatures who petrify their victims to steal their souls, were behind the curse of their land. But instead of combating them, they'd capture travelers and offer them as sacrifices to the basilisks, who'd become their false idols. They would even set up traps throughout their domain for that purpose. Among those travelers was Ornifex, a half-crow, half-woman creature who parallels them as their inversion. Her clan, the noble house of Karim, used to be Valko worshippers who, upon hollowing, had their shapes twisted by the egregor which they cultivated. Upon arriving at the distant north, the Lion Knight would order the construction of Ilium Lois, a name that is a combination of Ellen, meaning torch, and Louise, meaning renowned warrior. His castle would be built atop the core of the old chaos. As Forossa had fallen, the Lion Knight had been proclaimed King of Ilium Lois. He'd be called the Ivory King, for his iconic armor would be built from the frozen ivory mineral, a product of the chaos, which sucked the heat out of anything it could, exclusive to the White Desert. A residential area for the knights was constructed next, in which they'd begin their training to prepare themselves to fight against the demons. The Ivory King and his forces would meet the demonic creatures, whose heat was sucked from their bodies by the old chaos, giving in to an unnatural coldness. 7 saber-toothed tiger demons reigned supreme over the territory. The king would subjugate each one of them in combat and tame them, keeping them as pets. The creatures became impressed with his might and felt attracted to the warmth of his enormous soul. So, upon their defeat, they'd allow themselves to be domesticated by him. The Ivory King taming the demons he defeated mirrors the story of Flann, Gwyn's firstborn, and his taming of the Stormdrake. Before the king's throne room is a statue of Flann. He is depicted as a gentle shepherd. The king's campaign against the demons took a long time to finish, and throughout it, Ilium Lois also has to contend with the curse. The greedy undead of Ilium Lois, that is, criminals who steal from or murder others, who belonged to the lower classes, would be thrown away in a cave and made to starve away, to the point where they'd have to resort to eating each other. As is the rule in Miyazaki's works, a symbolic punishment was devised for their crimes. The result was the cultivation of a covetous demon. The covetous demons were used as tests of might to the knights, who would be ordered to kill and claim the demon's fermented soul for themselves. The training ritual was also symbolic of the rivalry between Forossa and Jugo, the two neighboring nations used to fight each other in the eastern desert. The covetous demon represents the men of Jugo. In fact, their very leader, Aurous, turned into such a monster. He is the boss we face as the Earthen Peak. It's interesting to note that the helmets of the Knights of Ilium Lois are based on those of jousting suits. This is because of the extreme, demiurgic, cold winds of the snowy desert. They had to cover the entirety of their faces to mitigate the demonic presence of the land. The greedy undead of Ilium Lois, who belongs to the upper classes, would be turned into mimics. That is, they'd be sealed inside a cursed chest, which would drain their vigor and fuse their flesh with it, turning them into demonic creatures which reflect as their covetous nature. The mimics would also inversely be used to guard treasures and to hide secrets by punishing those who attempt to steal them, with a fate fitting for a thief. A mechanism was designed to banish away the masses of undead, for the curse was proving to be a great issue for Ilium Lois the more time passed. Those close to hollowing would be taken to the northern frontier and sealed into coffins, which would be thrown down the wall onto a barren stretch of snow that was filled with wild, demonic stallions, and whose limit hosted 2 of the king's pets, Lloyd and Zalen, who were instructed to grant mercy to the undead who managed to reach that far in their aimless pilgrimage. After finally defeating all the demon kings of the north, the Ivory King wanted to take his army in pilgrimage to the south and reconquer the castle which had belonged to his kingdom as to re-establish Forossa, and after that, he plans to become a true king by linking the fire. But just before that could happen, a woman would appear before him, for she was intuitively attracted to his gleaming soul. Alsana, an ironic name deriving from a combination of Elsa, meaning God is my oath, and Dana, meaning grave or favor. She, like Elena, was a fragment of Manus, the father of the Abyss. She was the incarnation of his fear. The Ivory King would immediately fall in love with her, as the dark presents a powerful temptation to any man. Alsana would propose to the Ivory King a prophesied solution to the old chaos, for she was an oracle, a priest, like Elena. She'd ask of the king to perpetually quell the chaos by feeding it with his kingly soul, along with those of his powerful knights, to forsake martyrdom, his ambition to link the fire, and rule over Ilium Lois for a long, long time, betraying the heavens for the material. Alsana would fund an order of priestesses, and a residential area would be built for them. They'd watch over Ilium Lois with one of Alsana's eyes, which have the special power to see that which is hidden, to see that which the chaos had taken out of view. Each great priestess would inherit the eye and return it upon dying. The priestesses would partake in rituals of appeasing the old chaos, by feeding it with the souls of the warriors of Ilium Lois. The rituals, whose stated goal was to halt the chaos, were only effective to appease it, in the short term. In truth, they served to nurture it in the long term. The rituals also ruined the chances of the king and his knights rebelling, as their souls waned, and the kingdom fell into stagnation and later decayed alongside them. The Abyss and the Chaos share a common goal, which is to restore and prolong the domain of the sun, for one is linked to the other, which is why the demons of Izalith were instructed to oppose the chosen undead in Lordran. They couldn't allow for the fire to be linked, for that would mean the draining of their parasitical sun alongside Gwyn's. Thus, by the time of Dark Souls 3, after the fire had been linked many times, the demons turned to stone. Over time, the king noticed that Elsana's proposal was a Falchian bargain, that the chaos would never be subsumed. Or perhaps he had noticed from the start, but he loved her at first sight and so allowed himself to be fooled. As his power was almost depleted, he'd make his last decree to please his lover, one final time. Alongside his best knights, he'd plunge down into the chaos and sacrifice himself to link it. Before leaving to meet his fate, he'd give Elsana a sword named after his kingdom, a special weapon that can restore one's life, the opposite of what she has done to him and his kingdom. It was a way of letting her know he was aware of her lies, but still chose to die for her. It was what he had done for her, for the old chaos, for the Abyss. He'd betrayed his cause for love. The Ivory King parallels Artorias, the Abyss Walker. Both were the highest-ranking warriors of their clans, tamed great beasts who bowed down to them out of their own volition and were ultimately taken advantage of, for they were too pure and noble-hearted, and deceived into sacrificing themselves for the sake of the Abyss, and both were left-handed. His once ivory armor, a beautiful suit of immaculate white, was charred and darkened, as was his once blindingly white soul blackened, for as is above, so is below, such as those of his knights, who parallel Gwyn's loyal silver knights who followed him to his doom, and charged their armors. The king's sacrifice emboldened the chaos to the point where it would consume the entirety of Ilium Lois in one fell swoop, turning its inhabitants into demons, freezing each of its buildings, and busting open its gate from the explosive icy winds. An incident that mirrors the ritual that birthed the Bed of Chaos, which resulted in an eruption that consumed Izalith, turning its inhabitants into demons, and spreading lava everywhere. Even though she was an agent of the dark, whose very nature demanded she spread corruption, Elsana would be moved by her king's corrupted sacrifice, which was done out of the profound love he had for her, and come to deeply regret her actions. She'd entrust a champion, a bearer of the curse, with her final wish, to free her king from chaos, and upon granting her the wish, she'd tell him to reach his journey's end, to avoid the temptation of the dark and achieve gnosis, to become a true king, to link the fire, and realize her lord's original ambition.
I have but one wish. That my dear lord might be freed from that unspeakable chaos. I haven't the strength to help him myself. But perhaps one such as you. Though I am yet to know your name, stranger, will you lend me your strength? Kind visitor, I thank you. Let me open the path to chaos. And please, do all you can.
The New World had fallen into ruin. Its civilization had mostly collapsed, and the three men who had aspired to become true kings, to link the fire, were tainted by the dark and felled by it. However, a new wave of migrants would reach the continent. Vendrick, whose name means powerful revolutionary, the warrior who led the expedition alongside his younger brother Aldia, a scholar, was a man who had conquered the four lords of Lordran and completed his journey as the chosen undead. Much like Aurous, he had seen that the previous generations of Firelinkers had failed in their quest of restoring the time of day, the Age of Fire, and he supposed they were too weak to feel the sun. Thus, he concluded he should seek even more souls to become greater than his predecessors. Of course, he was fooled by the scheme of the rogue deity, Velka, and by Gwyndolin's lies. He too was fueled by the propaganda that claims that by linking the fire, one is following Gwyn's will of prolonging the age of fire, when in truth, the opposite occurs. By choosing to avoid the flame, he became a Dark Lord. He was instructed by Gwendolyn through the primordial serpents, who had become his advisors, to use his vast power to create an empire, in a distant land where more great souls resided. Then, he would inherit their strength and become even greater, which would enable him to become a true king unlike any other. Vendrick's journey would lead him to the Dragon Shrine, where he would find the worms. His brother Aldia had claimed the manor, which used to be Havel's castle, and built a cage at its end, which was designed to attract the drakes from the Eyrie, and trap them, so that the knights who follows the brothers could tame them. Thus, the Order of the Dragon Riders was created. The shield of Vendrick's Dragon Riders is modeled after Kaita's tears. Vendrick's journey would lead him to the castle, which used to belong to the king and queen of the New World. Upon conquering it, he declared the name of his all-encompassing empire, which would become both the name of his castle to the north, and of the New World itself, Drangleic, the Kingdom of Dragons. Drangleic is symbolic of this middle step of the Firelink conspiracy. The dragons were not only being reborn, at this time as worms, an intermediary form, but were also tamed by men and not hunted down. Gwyn's will was being supplanted by Velka's. Justice was gradually being served on a macrocosmic level. Amidst his travels, the king would meet Llewellyn, a blacksmith who knew how to forge equipment from Bastille, the secret alloy, and hire him as the castle's resident master-smith. The man would only supply his work to a select few, but Vendrick would earn his loyalty and admiration for his noble character. His work is easily identified by its lack of ostentation, as Llewellyn focused on an economy of simplicity and strength, which is also emblematic of the king's mentality. In his mansion at Majula, Aldia meticulously traced a map of the entire continent, using the knowledge he had gathered throughout his travels. Vendrick's soldiers carried a metallic leaf on their chests, a symbol of the Way of Blue, and their armors are symbolic of fire-linking. Their helmets are silver, depicting the waning of the sun, and the rise of the moon, with its light being transferred to the underworld, passing through their chests as red and through their skirts as white and yellow. The soldiers of Drangleic parallel the paladins of the Way of White as their inversions. They are paladins of the Way of Blue. Those of White wish to call upon a new dawn, ending the endless night, and those of Blue wish to call upon a new night, ending the stagnant, curse-filled day. As a way of testing the next generations of Undead, the brothers would transform the castle they occupied, which they named after their kingdom, into a glorified trial of strength, fitting as the kingdom itself would, in the future, become one as well. They would fill the castle with traps, and Vendrick would sculpt golems that were fashioned after the legends he'd heard on his travels, and Aldia would reproduce and reanimate puppets which he'd found throughout the continent. The brothers would combine their efforts to create a masterpiece, the Looking Glass Knight, an automaton that represents both the Ribis and the Undead. It would be positioned at the castle's end, as the place that would be called the King's Corridor. The design of the Looking Glass Knight is particularly interesting. Its white armor denotes purity, and he wears a crown of thorns on his head, a direct reference to Jesus Christ, who the chosen Undead is a metaphor of. As previously established, fire-linking is analogous to Christianity. The multiple faces adorning his armor are indicative of the collective of Undead who journey to link the fire, and the tears they shed are a reference to Velka, or rather, Kaita, the goddess of tears, as she is mostly known for in the New World. His lightning-imbued sword stands for the masculine, while his mirror shield stands for the feminine. From it, the golem can summon the spirits of Undead from other worlds to aid in his task, like a maiden would call for a knight's help and protection, or like a journeying Undead would call for spirits of other worlds for aid. The sword was the work of Vendrick, while the shield was Aldia's, as confirmed by the presence of dimension-warping dark mirrors in his manse. The two pairs of angelic wings represent both the wings of the archdragons, as well as the sanctified nature of the duty of fire-linking Undead, who, through self-sacrifice, reach the heavens. And adorning his chestplate is a golden crest of Drangleic, which was inherited from the dual empire of Havel and Alphys. As previously explained, It depicts the two primordial serpents transformed into dragons, and fire linking by the sword which pierces a flower, a symbol of the sun. The golem would impose a trial upon the undead who wished to serve the King of Dragonslayer as his royal knights. Those who passed the trial would ascend meritocratically to that rank, for Vendrick was a fair ruler who valued a man's valor above all. The king's corridor was filled with animated statues crafted by Vendrick, which depicts idealized warriors of Jugo, which he learned of from stories of natives of the New World. Relentless knights with a horse's head, which was Jugo's crest animal, though, in legend, they were fused together with the warriors themselves, and brandishing twin blades, agile weapons that enables them to never cease their attack. Dragonslayer could incorporate the mythologized story of the New World into its own identity. The legacy of various fallen nations, such as Forossa, Jugo, Venn and Alken, would be an integral part of the Continental Empire. Many brave warriors would face the trial of the King's Corridor, but only a select few would succeed. Most notably were two victors, Velstad, who became the King's Aegis, and Raimi, who became the King's Sword. Vendrick's forces would explore the entirety of the continent, even finding the three alienated kingdoms which belongs to the three kings who failed to link the fire. He'd build a shrine to each of them to link them to the empire he was gradually establishing, the design of the shrines being emblematic of the ruin of his predecessors. Three beheaded snakes, which symbolize the greedy, covetous kings, encircling a lord vessel-like structure, which bore a tiny, gentle light within, which represented the fading first flame they failed to link. Vendrick would carve warning messages in tablets of stone and position them around the shrines to guide the undead who follows their path. The king and his brother would also create primal bonfires from the remains of the four great beings they defeated in their journey, to facilitate the travels of the next generations of journeying undead. Indeed, Vendrick, Naudia's expedition of the New World, mirrors the journey of the bearer of the curse, and they wished for brave adventurers to inherit their will and link the fire after them. While the older brother was busy conquering the lands, Aldia would incessantly study the curse of undead with the information he could gather from the New World. He would call the curse the first sin upon learning of its origin by the hand of the Lord of Light, Gwyn. This title is very relevant, as it too is related to the religious themes of Dark Souls. It alludes to the temptation and sin of Adam and Eve, which doomed humanity. Aldia would invite scholars of all lands to his keep, not discriminating against warlocks and hexers, for he'd go to any lengths necessary if it meant he could solve the curse. He would create chimeric beings in hopes of transcending the curse, but it resulted in one failure after the other. Among the spoiled fruits of his research are three half-man, half-dragon creatures, the kobolds, who have been created through basilisk DNA, and so their bites can inflict curse, the cyclopic ogres, who have a tough exterior, though one that pales in comparison to the stone scales of the dragons, and the undead aberrations, whose bone structure is terribly malformed. The mastodon chimeras were also created during this wave of experiments, though they would not be employed as warriors until much, much later. Aldia would not only experiment on his fellow men, he'd even use his research partners as test subjects, which is why some of the monsters of the Mans dropped the equipment of Aldia's subordinates upon death. As said before, Vendrick inherits the crest which belongs to the First Empire of Heide, the original name of the continent. In accordance with that, he would also inherit the immaculate, uncorrupted, original will of his predecessors and prepare to become the truest of kings. He was set to link the fire. That was until a priestess appeared before him with a prophecy. She claimed he should delay the linking of the fire and prepare for war against a foreign threat, an army of giants that would bring calamity to his land and invalidate his legacy otherwise, ruining the prospects of others following in his footsteps to become true kings after him. Despite both Vendrick and Aldia being wary of priests, for they were instructed by the serpents of their often dark intentions, the king heeded her words, for his heart had been stolen by that woman, and as such, he was blinded to reason. Her name was Nashandra, which can be separated into Na, a prefix which means not, and Sandra, meaning protector of humanity. Instead of waiting for the invaders to assault Dragonslayer, Vendrick decided to invade their land preemptively. The expedition he led was also intended to confirm Nashandra's words of the existence of that elusive army of giants. After all, the king could detect a nefarious intent under her holy exterior, but to his surprise, he found it. Gilia, the exiled hexer that desires to enact revenge upon Heide, and ruled it as a true Dark Lord, an archetypal Antichrist, had spent hundreds of years sculpting a legion of powerful barbarian golems with the remains of dragons he'd found in his exile. That is, a treasure of titanite slabs, which were present on an island, as the world before the Dragon War was Pangea-like, and was only shattered as a result of the war, through the dark and chaotic arts, both of which scale with faith and intelligence. He plans to assault and ravage the mainland with his giants, meaning Nashandra's prophecy was a half-truth, and she posited that Vendrick should vanquish this Dark Lord, which would, symbolically, turn him into a Lord of Light as the opposite of that adversary, a title Gwyn held in the distant past. What Vendrick didn't know is that Gilead was no more. The giants had refused to be enslaved by him, and rebelled against their wicked master. The giant who killed Gilead had become their king, and he only wished for his people to live in peace, secluded from the world in their little island. His master's death would be deeply imprinted in his memory. The spell Gilead conjured in an attempt of avoiding the death blow, the Hex Repel, is transposable through his soul. Giants are creatures of pure, innocent hearts. As evil as Gilead was, his creations, born into slavery, likely still harbored love for their maker. Now assuming Nashandra's prophecy to be the whole truth, Vendrick massacres the giants, who were taken by surprise and didn't intend to fight a war. Upon his victorious return to Drang Lake, he brought with him a score of their bodies. He'd keep half of them for himself, which he'd turn into golems, that is, mindless slave workers, and gives the other half to Aldia, so that he could use them in his experiments. In reality, Nashandra had encountered the island where the giants lived with Gilead during her journey to Drang Lake. Thus, why she came up with her prophecy. The prophecy says the giants would invade Drang Lake, which was, precisely, the original plan of Gilead, who spent a long time preparing his revenge. What she called a prophecy was, in truth, a veiled warning, though she cloaked it in the language of fate to appear messianic. An era of unprecedented peace and prosperity would befall Drang Lake, an age of fire with a magnificent sun gleaming above. This was the culmination of ages of the curse being unchallenged by firelinking. All of the contenders for the throne of Ash had failed to corruption, and the souls of the new world served as fuel to the sun, the celestial demiurge. The three monarchs of yore had ignored their duty, and Vendrick would follow in their footsteps. His journey mirrored Gwyn's. He was, initially, a fair and brave warrior who respected valor above all, a man who fought against a powerful enemy for the sake of his people, a great unifier who created an all-encompassing empire. But with success and power came corruption, and he became a shadow of his former self. The Lord of Light would become a Dark Lord, the once revolutionary who'd call upon stagnation and decay. Through the power of the giants, that is, with his newly built titanite golems, which were inspired by those he saw in Lium Lois, Vendrick could extensively reform and expand the castle he and Nashandra, who had become his queen, occupied, a gesture made with the intent of impressing Nashandra. Through careful examination, it is possible to see precisely what is and isn't new. The parts of the castle built by Vendrick during this period of material abundance were made with black stone and are significantly more ornate than the rest of the structure. The extravagant monuments of pure gold he'd sculpted for the castle are indicative of the greed he was festering within him. The stationary golems he would place throughout the castle, which only activate through soul absorption, are also emblematic of his excesses. Chancellor Welliger doesn't even recognize the reformed castle when he becomes amnesiac. Tremendous was the scope of the reforms. He says, quote, "What has happened to our castle?" Many statues of legendary figures of the New World were sculpted to adorn the halls and rooftops of the castle. Romanticized depictions of the relentless warriors from the fallen kingdom of Jugo, the ancient warrior golems of Heide, the belfry gargoyles of Venn. It was a display of Drang Lake's inheritance, and of its domain over the entirety of the continent's territory. Vendrick would also commission a portrait of Nashandra, and the painter, who was a master of his craft, would create an image so accurate as to capture the queen's soul within it. As a result, the painting would curse those who looked at it, extracting their souls, like Nashandra was absorbing Vendrick's, turning him from a bright sovereign into a dark husk. As the king basked in his newfound wealth and power alongside his queen, his noble ambition faded from his mind. The warrior king had grown accustomed to a life of debauchery. The castle, which had once stood as a beacon of fire-linking, was subverted into an embodiment of hedonism. The resident mastersmith of Drangleic Castle, Llewellyn, would gift Vendrick an ornate sword, which he'd simply call the King's Greatsword. Its blade was a giant sculpture of the Queen. Llewellyn went against his motto of practicality to create the last piece he'd make for his king. In actuality, the weapon was too big to even be called a sword. Massive, thick, heavy, and far too rough. It was an affront, a mockery of the king and his parasitic queen. The absurd weight of the weapon reflected Nashandra's terrible, dark burden upon the king, the sword's owner. Llewellyn defected from Drangleic, as Vendrick had betrayed his trust by abandoning the virtues which had merited his loyalty. The king would be so shocked and hurt by the gift that the sword would be deeply imprinted into his memory, and in the future, the bearer of the curse would be able to recreate it from his soul. And suddenly, the giants attacked. Nashandra's prophecy was self-fulfilled. Cyan, one of Vendrick's strongest knights, a man who bested the king's corridor, would form a front line and rush to face the giants at the shores, but he'd die a martyr's death. In Cyan's honor, the king would forge copies of his armor and gift them to a new order of knights which he'd name after him. The Titanite Vendrick had obtained from the giants he'd slain was ever abundant, and he'd fortify his troops with a nearly unlimited supply of powerful and ornate equipment. In contrast to Drangleic's forces, the giants wielded simple clubs and axes made from stone and conjured primitive pyromancies with their dark-imbued left hands, sourced from their innards. And suddenly, the giants attacked, for they fought with inhuman ferocity and hate, unlike what they had shown themselves to be capable of doing, when they were being exterminated by the unprompted war that preceded their attack. Before, they were docile, they had no reason to fight. Now, they were motivated by revenge, and like undead who rose back from death, they were hollowed. They were so different, both physically, as their faces were sucked in by an empty hole, and in the way they fought. The knights and soldiers who'd battled them in the past could barely recognize them, questioning if they were even the same beings. The king would do everything within his means to house the invasion. He would reanimate the Iron King's ironclad soldiers and send them to the front lines. He would also find the mastodon chimeras his brother had created, and restore them to serve him as warriors. The king was so desperate he'd order Volstagh to lead the stone soldiers and knights of the king's corridor he'd sculpted, to serve as guardians of his castle and testers of the undead, in battle against the giants. Vendrick himself would fight alongside his warriors, despite his newfound appeal for the material. He was desperate to protect the earthly paradise he had built. As previously explained, these giants were like men, and were likewise affected by the curse. The word the Japanese text uses for the giants consists of both giant and human. As the giants fought against Vendrick's men on their island, they absorbed the cursed sparks of flame and became undead. As a result, they rose again with only one memory left in their souls, their feelings of hatred and desire for retribution. Nashandra had used them as scapegoats, as a way of holding both man and giant hostage to a perpetual war that could only result in their souls being absorbed by the sun, which, in turn, would strengthen the abyss. The giants implying their dark left hands as catalysts for their spells is a reference to the occult concept of the left-handed path, but it doubles as a reference to the unjust persecution of the left-handed by ignorant men who interpreted the esoteric literally. The Lord of the Giants would be defeated by the brave men of Drangleic, and his body was taken to the depths of the Cardinal Tower, where he'd be left to wane and later become the last giant. Perhaps he was defeated by Vendrick himself, or perhaps he would be mysteriously defeated by a warrior from another time, who'd claim his soul and the giant's kinship for himself. Or perhaps all of these things happened. The war would last for generations. A man who'd fought against the giants would have his son sent to war, and his son would have a son who'd be sent to war. Both sides would fight in this seemingly unending conflict until their souls faded to the point of nigh emptiness. The soldiers would become hollows, and the giants would turn into trees, like the original stone arch trees, made from titanite, turned into wooden trees. Drangleic's soldiers had their necks broken from looking up at the giants, and they kept fighting even when their enemies couldn't move anymore. The only thing driving their simple, empty minds was revenge. Realizing his foolish mistake, and the inevitability of the doom he had brought upon his empire, Vendrick would disappear from the world. and in the microcosm which reflects the macrocosm, his soul, which was once the most powerful to have ever resided within a man, had been reduced to an ember, drained by Nashandra's curse. That is, by the curse of Undead. Even if he'd wanted to link the fire, he'd only turn into unkindled ash, as his once gleaming soul was now barren, as was his ambition. The once selfless, powerful revolutionary was now a crestfallen old man. As he was about to leave his post, his right and left-handed man would clash with each other, for one would choose to remain by the king's side to the bitter end, remaining loyal to the man himself, and the other would choose to remain loyal to the noble ideals which the man had abided by in the past. Vel'Stas would best Raimi in a duel. The victor would accompany his king to his final resting place, to stand as his guard, and the loser would plan for revenge against Nashandra, who he knew was behind Drangleick's downfall. Before Vendrick vanished, he left behind many obstacles along the roads to link the fire, to stop the bearers of the curse. He'd ordered the construction of the gates of the king, which would only open with a magical key, the king's ring, and then tasked his loyal company of the Scion Knights to guard over them, as well as to guard over chests which contained sublime bone dust. Scion's name is a clever pun with cyanide, for he became known for his suicidal charge, and the order of knights named after him, the Scion Knights, subverted the will of the man it was named after by gatekeeping the remains of martyrs the bearers of the curse seek. Vendrick had also tasked the Dragon Riders to serve as obstacles to that journey as well, some of whom would be positioned in key locations, like the one who guards the exit of the Tower of Flame, and who ordered his fire drakes to gatekeep the bridge to the Church of Blue as to forbid Undead from joining the Blue Sentinels to help their fellow journeymen. He'd also hire all Drangleick's operating mercenaries, including Volgan's falconers, and the remnants of old Forossa, to guard the altar of the Things Betwixt, and the Shrine of Winter, to house the journeying Undead in their path. And finally, the king had sealed his own brother, who he knew would conspire against his queen's wishes, within his manse. Vendrick could go hollow in the Crypt of Undead, walking in circles for eternity, surrounded by statues of Nito, an omen of death and decay, a man who aided Gwyn in spreading the curse. Like Vendrick, a fitting fate for the greedy king who abandoned martyrdom for his foolish dream of an eternal empire. By defeating the Hollow King, the bearer of the curse is finally freeing him from his limbo, and redeeming his soul by inheriting his original will of linking the fire, an act which mirrors the battle between a hallowed Gwyn and the chosen Undead, who inherited Gwyn's original will of empowering mankind by aiding in the curse's dispelling.
Seeker of fire, conqueror of dark. I too sought fire once. With fire, they say, a true king can harness the curse. A lie, but I knew no better. Seeker of fire, you know not the depth of dark within you. It grows deeper still, the more flame you covet. Flame, oh, flame.
When Vendrick talks to the bearer of the curse, he cites a couple verses of an old tale, the tale that is narrated by an old woman before the first game starts, confirming the narrator to have been an in-universe character. When Aldia had confined himself to the manor, he'd hired a time traveler from Mirrah, Azlathiel, the brother of Lucatiel, as a guard. Azlathiel was an extremely skillful swordsman, one of the greatest knights of the harsh country of Mirrah. He's traveled far from his home, and into the future hoping to find a cure for the curse. A familiar journey which many characters from Dark Souls 1 to Dark Souls 3 face. Aldia seemed like the man he was looking for. A scholar who wished to solve the mystery of life and free mankind from the dark sign. But he would not only remain undead, but become a vengeful ghost, destined to gatekeep the demands of his master unto eternity, like a hollow. Even if he'd wished to abandon his post, Vendrick had built a king's gate at the keep's exit, and none who were inside would ever leave it. And so, his sister, Lucatiel, would ever wonder what happens to her adventurous brother. Aldia created 3 more beings with remains of giants, though each being was a unique individual and not a new species of chimera. Sweet Shokwar was a talking cat who'd inherited the dragon's wisdom, as well as a power similar to their immortality. She displays a crown-looking pattern on the fur of her head, symbolizing her elucidation and artificial ancestry to the ancient rulers of nature. Her blue eyes are a reference to the moon, which powers the dragons with its moonlight during the Age of Ancients. She resides near the mansion Aldia had built in Majula, which, in the past, he occasionally occupies during his travels. She was tasked by Aldia to serve as a guide to the undead who'd make their liminal home in Majula, which is why she imparts knowledge to the bearer of the curse about the 4 great beings we must hunt to fulfill our fire-linking journey. And as expected for a Velka-adjacent character, she exposes, in a cynical tone, failed monarchs for their sins, and, just like in the first game, the protagonist is instructed to hunt the sinners down, which are reincarnations of the ones from the previous game, claim their souls and use them as fuel to link the fire in a ritual of self-sacrifice. Shanalot, whose name derives from Shana, which is the short for Shannon, and means wise, ancient, and river, and Charlotte, which means free woman, was a half-dragon, half-woman being who existed outside of the corporeal realm. She can teleport with the use of the aged feather, which is a symbol of freedom and derives from a bird, that is, a descendant of the dragons that inherits their wings. She was, however, paradoxically, ironically, confined to the Dragon Shrine, for Aldia's mansion was locked away by the King's Gate, and spiritually chained to the bonfires, for she was tasked with becoming the greatest firekeeper by Aldia. Thus, her epitaph, Emerald Herald, emerald being the fire-storing material from which the Estus flask is made, which is why she can graft shards onto the flask of the bearer of the curse. In alchemy, emerald is the material representative of the connection between the spiritual and the material, which is why the Emerald Tablet, which contains the wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus, and whose content centers around the phrase as above, so below, is made out of it. And finally, Aldia managed to create his magnum opus, the Ancient Dragon, an almost perfect replica of his primal ancestors. It would rest at the Dragon Shrine's end, tasked with guarding the Ashen Mist Hearts, an artifact that allows one to enter the soul's memories, which the dragon would only give to the undead who proved their worth by reaching its sanctuary, near the height of his journey. Aldia, whose name means time, phase, and maturing, referring to his role as a scholar who would both transcend the curse himself and aid others to do the same, for the whole of mankind, by linking the fire, went against the path his brother had chosen, and so prepared for the next generations of undead, who'd have to inherit his original will of becoming the King of Kings.
No one has come this far, not for a very long while. Your Honor, you wish to share this curse? Then accept the fate of your youth, and face the trials that await you. Unless you have already joined the crestfallen. Young Havel, there are but 2 paths. Inherit the order of this world, or destroy it. Outgrown Havel, have you what it takes? Truly. Young Havel, seek after Venric. He who almost became a true monarch.
Aldia studies the bonfire ascetics. They are, essentially, the hearts of the golems of the New World, and when consumed by a bonfire, they spread their light into that particular stretch of time-space, advancing it and reinforcing the souls that live within it, which is also what happens when the player begins a new game cycle, which, like nearly every single mechanic of Dark Souls, is canonically integrated into the game's narrative, as this series of videos will prove. That is the explanation for the dozens of dark spirits that roam Drangleic in New Game Plus. The world has been filled with more light, and so its connection to the spiritual realm has been amplified. The enemies and bosses are stronger for there bear more souls within them, thus the increased rewards. The greater soul memory of the bearer of the curse is what attracts Freja, the greedy spider, to him before he can even enter Tseldora. The same is true for invaders in general. The stronger one's soul memory, the stronger the invaders he attracts. After he'd finished his contributions to the journey of Undead, Aldia would resume his experiments to uncover the key to transcending life itself. Inspired by an abyssal living suit of armor he'd faced in his travels, the Pursuer, Aldia would conduct a dark ritual, similar to the incidents that had produced the red-eye orb of the Dark Raves, to create the Forlorn, a ghost that lacked a physical existence. The ghost would be sentenced to eternally haunt the lands, for he was no one, and knew only to kill men, perhaps in an attempt to obtain a body for himself to inhabit. Aldia's next experiment would be an inversion of the previous one. He'd attempt to transcend life by removing one's spirit from his body. He'd conduct a dark ritual that would exorcise the soul of a partner scholar, the court sorcerer of Dragonslayer, who'd been locked within the mansion alongside his master. The ritual resulted in the scholar being possessed by the abyssal spirit of Navlan, an ancient hexer. Navlan had pursued the secret art of reincarnation. For his heresy, collective punishment befell his entire clan. However, by the time of his execution, he had already managed to formulate the spell which would enable his resurrection. His body would die alongside his family, but his soul had escaped it moments before. He'd swear vengeance upon the world that had been so unfair to him and his people. The familial team, paired with a pursuit of a secret art of revival, ties Navlan to Pinwheel, the masked necromancer of Dark Souls 1. And the prefix of his name, Na, relates him to the reincarnations of Manus' fractured soul, such as Nashandra and Nadalia. Recognizing the grave danger presented by Navlan, should he freely make use of his newly acquired vessel, the court sorcerer, who still had a degree of control over his body, a predicament like that of Jekyll and Hyde from the classic work of literature, would lock himself away. In a reference to the questline of Mephistopheles, a character from Demon's Souls, the scholar would ask of the undead who freed him to kill each person who had made contact with him in the past, fearing they'd be susceptible to possession by the dark soul of the hexer. Lastly, Aldia would make one final effort. He'd use himself as a subject of the next experiment. Through a ritual that involves the sacrifice of his corporeal self, he managed to free himself from his prison and transcend life. But his existence had to be linked to the bonfires, or he'd have faded away into nothingness. He would only be able to manifest in the material realm as a grotesque wooden head. He'd become akin to a failed Rebis. His voice was twisted into sounding like a combination of a man's and a woman's, and his bizarre wooden form is the result of having injected his body with the essence of the giants, in an attempt of empowering himself with the essence of the dragons. His condition mirrors that of the firekeepers who were linked to special bonfires and relied on them to exist, which is poetic considering his devotion to fire linking. One of his eyes is hollowed, like that of an undead. The other emits a red glow, as would the eye socket of an abyssal creature. Aldia is the inversion of the warrior king who falls prey to nihilism. He is a life-loving scholar who self-sacrifices in an attempt to reach an answer to the oppressive mysteries of the world. When felled, he drops no souls, for he has no existence outside of the network of bonfires and can't be killed in combat. His fight was but a final test to the bearer of the curse, which the old, crestfallen King Vendrick, Aldia's beloved brother, was supposed to have been responsible for after he'd linked the fire, a responsibility which he forsook. Raimi, Vendrick's right-hand knight, wanted to free Dragonslayer from Nashandra's accursed shackles. He traveled through the lands in search of her sisters, who he'd challenged in an attempt to prepare himself to face the queen. Nadalia was one of the fragments of the abyss who desired for the powerful soul of a sovereign she could taint. However, she arrived late, for the Iron King had already corrupted himself. Having lost her purpose, she decided to settle within the Brume Tower, caring for its forlorn inhabitants like she was their mother. She'd raise them from their ashes and fill them with warmth. Raimi stormed the abandoned complex and fought against its guards, until he was faced with Nadalia. Instead of smiting her, he developed empathy towards the forsaken woman, for he'd see himself in her. He'd swear an oath to her, abdicating his desire for rebellion. As he now stood as her eternal guard, she granted him the power of ash, and healed him whenever he was hurt. He'd become the Fume Knight who protected the mother of the forlorn. Raimi's name derives from the Old English word Rayman, meaning outcry in reference to his rebellion against his former king, as well as to the pyromancy of the same name, which is acquired from Nadalia's soul. His epitaph, Fume Knight, is a clever translation of Smoke Knight, which is both literal and figurative, for he fumes with anger, as his soundtrack also suggests. His design subtly resembles a crow, the old shield he discarded being adorned with one, as well as his ring. His defense was much weaker in comparison to his old rivals, so he'd instead focus on his strengths, and take on a sword contaminated by ash, which belongs to the old Iron King's collection. Ironically, Raimi forsook his duty for a temptation similar to that which had taken his king. He became a hypocrite. Under Nadalia's rule, the Brume Tower was configured akin to the painted world of Ariamis, the abyssal priestess being like Velka, the nurturing mother of those who belong nowhere, or rather, her artificial daughter, Priscilla, the guardian of the painting. And Raimi parallels Jeremiah, her protector, who betrayed his queen due to her corruption. After his exile, during which he travels to enemy territory to defect, to honor Londo, he devoted himself to Fina, the goddess of love. Lake was no more. The continent gradually sunk into the damp, dark abyss. The curse had taken its toll. The men would lose their souls to the dark side once again, and with them, their sense of self, their memories, a process that culminated in them forgetting their very births, which is what the introduction cinematic depicts happening. The bearer of the curse is like the newborn within the memory that is melting away. When that happened, they'd feel a mysterious pull towards Lake's decrepit gate. Despite existing only in the distant past, the land was replete with souls, and so, empty, dark-filled husks of men were attracted to it, like moths to a flame. Indeed, Lake was even manifesting into the dreams of their yearning minds. An old firekeeper would station herself in the middle of the road that led to the ruins of Lake. She'd serve as a guide to the undead who yearned. Her habit of spinning a thread is a reference to Klotos, the fate of Greek myth, who spun the thread of life and weaved destiny. Upon reaching the ruined gate, the undead would partake in a ritual. The blood moon, that is, an eclipse, would summon within a lake, whose reflection casted an image of the past, a whirlpool of darkness that served as a portal to the past, where Lake rested. Near the lake is a witch tree, swarmed by bright bugs. The wise tree is Quella, the god of dreams, who is Gwyndolin, and the bugs are metaphors for the undead, who are guided by him. Gwyndolin, who is also god of the dark moon and of the dark sun, the union of opposites, is the one who calls upon the eclipse. Quella means to quell, as Gwyndolin will quell the yearning of the accursed undead by freeing them from the dark side, and in the microcosm, by opening the way to Lake. It's worth mentioning that a white ring, a ring that turns one into a false white spirit, is associated with Quella, and Gwyndolin is the god of illusion. The undead would wake up on an altar at the Things Betwixt, a highly symbolic location where they'd begin their journey. It hosts an unending stretch of stone pillars, a reference to the Ash Lake, one with a particularly significant meaning. In ancient times, before the coming of life, the ash trees were made of stone, but as fire appeared, all stone was gradually twisted into wood for its interaction with it. The petrified trees of the Things Betwixt are omens of the cycles of nature, for the place symbolizes fire linking, the conspiracy to restore the world's balance. And conversely, the undead of Lake turned green, unlike their predecessors, because of their alchemical composition. Those who came from the dark, the pygmies, man's primordial ancestors, were born when the light cast by the first flame penetrated the soil. Their bodies were stone-like, because like every living being, they were made of titanite, which is merely the state of matter when it is imbued with souls. As previously explained, ages went by and the first flame was left unkindled, for those who were set to link the fire fell to the temptation of the dark. That caused the curse of undead to become stronger than ever, which is why the bearer of the curse loses their health with each death, a penalty much stronger than that experienced by the chosen undead, who merely lost his human form, disconnecting himself from other worlds. In summary, the bearer of the curse has a body made of wood, which rots upon death, and as the new world is distant from Lordran, the world's epicenter, the dark sign manifests on their backs, for their backs face Gwyn's sun. Their decaying skin exposes their spines and ribs, forming a pattern that resembles a falling leaf. Similarly to the bearer of the curse, the ancient dragon, Aldia's nigh-perfect replica, has a brown, wooden body covered by vines, unlike the stone bodies of the true ancient dragons. This is also the reason why the durability mechanic works differently in Dark Souls 2. Lake is buried deep in the abyss, and each weapon is a soul, a memory, which is why their special attacks consume a lot of their durability. It is like when a caster casts a spell, and spells work through one's mind stat, and loses one of its uses. It stands to reason that the souls present in Lake were not as bright as those in Lordran, which means that its weapons aren't as durable. Everything is darker in Dragonslayer, thus the reason for the torch mechanic. The journeying Undead would reach a hut, where 3 more firekeepers lived. There, they'd be gifted a human effigy, a wooden handicraft manufactured by the firekeepers themselves, which would restore their humanity, in turn triggering them to remember who they are. This is what happens during the character creation. The Undead is rebuilding his image of himself. Then, the Red Witches warn him of the perils he'll face in his path, that he will die over and over again. The firekeepers are quite cynical and pessimistic, for they had seen countless travelers like him lose themselves. But ultimately, they still fulfill their duties, and tell the visitor to go on, and should he lose himself again, he'd be welcome to come back to receive their aid. The hut's design is highly symbolic. It is like the cave within the primordial arch tree, where the pygmies were born, the fireplace representing the first flame. The northern wall of the things betwixt bears a crack in the shape of a humanity, from which a white, dim light shines through. When the bearer of the curse proved himself worthy of the throne, Nashandra would appear before him. Like a moth to a flame, she was attracted to his gleaming soul. She would gatekeep the throne so none could link the fire. Upon her arrival, she praises the light above, while glorifying the spread of the abyss, for that is the nature of the curse.
Now, be one.
And this is the end of this video. Thank you for watching. If you want to support my work and get access to a Substack-like blog in which I post in-depth analysis of works of an esoteric nature, ranging from movies to manga to music clips, as well as my insights on philosophy and religion, you can check out my Patreon.